The earth had frozen over. Temperatures kept dropping, turning cities into wastelands buried under thick snow. Roads had vanished, and skyscrapers stood silent, frozen in time. A lone newscaster stood in the middle of an abandoned city, wrapped in heavy winter gear. The wind screamed between the buildings, carrying flurries of snow past him. His breath was visible in the freezing air. The broadcast continued. The government urged people to stay strong, to hold on. Survival was still possible. But behind the newscaster, something moved, an aircraft flying too low. The plane wobbled. The engine sputtered, struggling against the cold. The nose tilted downward. Then, impact. The aircraft slammed into the frozen ground. Metal twisted. Flames erupted, spreading fast against the ice-covered city. The shockwave tore through the streets. Ice cracked. Buildings shook. Fire and frost collided in violent chaos. Somewhere else, a television flickered in the darkness. The crash replayed over and over, flames reflecting on the screen. Someone was watching. The room was silent, except for the sound of footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. A figure moved toward the door, stopping just for a moment before reaching for the handle. A blonde woman in a pink coat stood at the entrance, her breath visible in the freezing air. She had been the one to call Han Feng's name. Han Feng opened the door and immediately tensed. He hadn't expected Hyona to show up at his home. He gestured for her to come inside, warning her not to stay out in the cold too long. She stepped in without hesitation, gripping the doorframe for support before shutting out the icy wind behind her. Without a word, she grabbed his coat and pulled him in, pressing her lips against his. The kiss was firm, deliberate. Han Feng stiffened, momentarily caught off guard, but she didn't let go. When they finally separated, their breathing was heavy. The warmth of her lips faded as the cold air settled back in between them. Han Feng studied her. This wasn't the Hyona he remembered. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no trace of the usual restraint. She didn't flinch. Her feelings had been buried for too long, and now, with the world as unstable as it was, she had no reason to keep them hidden. The crisis had changed everything. Uncertainty made it clear to her there was only one person she wanted to hold on to. She took his hand and pressed it against her chest, her heartbeat racing. The past didn't matter anymore. What mattered was now, and she wasn't going to wait any longer. Han Feng's eyes widened. Hyona's words weren't just unexpected, they were deliberate, laced with a certainty that left him momentarily speechless. Before he could react, her hand slid behind him, pressing firmly against him. Her leg brushed against his groin, the sudden contact sending a jolt through his body. Heat rushed to his face, but he was too stunned to move. He opened his mouth, hesitant, but before he could speak, Hyona silenced him with a single glance. There was no room for discussion. Her voice was calm, steady. She told him to close his eyes. Han Feng hesitated, but then did as she asked. His pulse quickened. Darkness swallowed his vision, heightening every other sensation. He barely had time to ask what was next before a shadow moved. The door creaked. A glint of steel flashed in the dim light. A figure lunged forward, weapon raised. Blood splattered against the wall. Hyona turned sharply, facing the attacker. The stranger barely looked at her, shaking blood from their weapon with a twisted smirk. In a world like this, one less mouth to feed was just simple math. Hyona wasted no time. She rummaged through Han Feng's belongings, searching for anything of value. Food, weapons, supplies, survival didn't allow for hesitation. Han Feng lay on the cold floor, blood pooling beneath him. His limbs felt heavy, his breath shallow. His mind drifted as he tried to grasp the sensation of dying. The attacker stepped closer to Hyona, eyes filled with amusement. Their voice was low, mocking, laced with something unsettling. They liked what they saw. They liked her performance. Han Feng lay motionless. The cold crept through his body, numbing everything except his thoughts. This was how it ended. Betrayed, left to die. Hyona had sealed his fate. If there was another life, he would make sure he never fell for someone like her again. Darkness surrounded him. Everything felt weightless. Then something appeared. A tiny flicker of light. It was distant, barely there. But it grew, slowly, steadily expanding until it was all he could see. The glow pulsed, warm and inviting. Han Feng reached out, curiosity overriding fear. The light was comforting. He had never felt anything like it. His fingers moved closer. The glow intensified, surrounding him. Was this it? The path to the afterlife? Something was wrong. The moment stretched. The sensation changed. The light wasn't pulling him in, it was cutting him off. A violent force exploded around him. Red energy engulfed his body, raw and searing. Pain surged through him, unbearable. A scream tore from his throat as the light consumed him. Han Feng jolted awake, his breath sharp and uneven. His mind reeled. The pain, the light, it had felt so real. But now, it was gone. A bad dream. His vision cleared. He was in a bedroom, sitting up in bed. Disoriented, he scanned the room. This wasn't the frozen wasteland. Where was he? 30 minutes passed. The morning light stretched across the walls as Han Feng stepped outside. Warmth kissed his skin. He reached out, letting the sunlight soak into his palm. He never thought he'd feel warmth again. His eyes drifted to a calendar. June 28th. The apocalypse had started on July 15th. His heart pounded. He had died. He was sure of it. Yet here he was. The realization hit. He had been reborn. Something caught his attention. His hand. A faint red glow pulsed beneath his skin. Han Feng turned his palm over, inspecting it closely. The glow didn't hurt. It just felt warm. It didn't seem to do anything. At first he thought he was imagining it. Then, suddenly he sneezed. Han Feng's eyes widened as his hand flared to life again, this time in bright green. The sudden shift in color caught him off guard. The glow intensified, spreading up his fingers. The energy surged larger, pulsating wildly. Alarmed, he rushed onto the balcony. The glow didn't fade. Instead, it seemed to pulse in sync with his heartbeat. Back inside, he turned his hand over under the dim light. It wasn't just glowing. It felt alive. Suddenly, the light shrank in an instant, flickering erratically, different from the red glow before. This one was unstable. Exhaustion hit him. He sank into the couch, his hand still pulsing, a steady reminder that something inside him had changed. The glow reflected off his skin. It hadn't faded yet. Instead, it seemed to be waiting. Then, the light twisted, forming something solid. Han Feng flinched, shaking his hand to remove it, but it wouldn't budge. A thought surfaced. This was too familiar. He had read stories where people came back changed, different. He gripped the curved blade of green energy that now extended from his hand. This wasn't just rebirth. It was something more. Han Feng turned his hand, gripping the curved energy blade that extended from his palm. It wasn't just for show. If he had been reborn, it only made sense protagonists always awakened with overpowered abilities. He tested the blade, trying to swing or command it. Nothing happened. No reaction, no special effect. Just a glowing weapon in his hand. His stomach growled. Loud. Painfully loud. Han Feng walked over to the fridge and yanked it open. Empty. Not even a single leftover. His vision wavered. If he didn't eat soon, he was going to pass out. Clearly, the universe wants him dead twice. His eyes landed on something, a jar of roasted soybeans. At first, he mistook them for popcorn. He slumped onto the couch, twisting open the lid. A leftover snack from before the apocalypse. Not a meal, but enough to keep him going. He'd need to hit the supermarket later. He grabbed a piece and rolled it between his fingers. Tilting his head back, he tossed the soybean into his mouth. Boom. A burst of dust exploded from his mouth. His eyes widened. A plant was growing. From his mouth. My man took you are what you eat, too literal for Christ's sake. Our MC stared at the plant in his hand, still stunned. Soybeans weren't supposed to do that. But here he was, holding proof that something was off. He turned the plant over, frowning. His exhaustion had vanished. Completely. The green glow that had once flickered on his hand was gone. Had the soybean plant somehow absorbed it? Curious, he plucked a single bean sprout from the plant. He peeled it open, revealing a fresh, untouched sprout inside. The moment he touched it, his body glowed green. The sprout vanished from his palm, dissolving into energy. His eyes widened. This wasn't normal. He had just unlocked something new. Something powerful. But as tempting as it was to explore this strange ability, priorities came first. The world was ending soon. He needed to stock up on supplies. As he stepped outside, a small, brightly colored bird chirped from a tree branch, oblivious to the fate that would soon befall the world. The streets were still bustling, a market full of life. People moved in all directions, haggling, laughing, completely unaware that their world only had days left. Our MC wandered through the city, his thoughts racing. The red glow, the sudden shift to green, the exhaustion, and then soybeans sprouting from his touch. None of it made sense. Even now, the memory felt unreal. What kind of power was this? He lifted his hand, staring at his palm. No glow. No strange energy. Yet, he knew something inside him had changed. A voice called his name. Familiar. He turned, instinct sharp. A woman stood before him, beautiful, blonde and smiling as she browsed the market. Her expression lit up the moment she saw him, as if their meeting was fate. Han Feng stiffened. He knew her. Li Huina. Han Feng's mind drifted back to the past. Like Huina, the goddess of his dreams, he had done everything to make her happy, bending over backward just for a chance to be in her world. When are these guys going to learn that being a nice guy simp doesn't work? Looking back now, the truth was obvious. He had never been her first choice, just a backup plan. A fallback guy, someone to keep around for convenience. Yup, friend zone like beta male simp, she's gonna be with Chatter Tyrone by the end of this story? Resentment flickered through him. Hyuna had nearly gotten him killed. One mistake, one misplaced trust, and he had paid the price. His fingers clenched over his chest as he forced himself to breathe. Revenge could wait. Right now, survival came first. He needed supplies, a plan, anything that would keep him ahead this time. A voice pulled him back to the present. Li Huina was still calling his name. She stepped closer, studying his face. Her expression shifted, curious, slightly amused. It didn't take much to see he had been lost in thought. Han Feng's expression shifted. He flashed a small, effortless smile and threw a smooth compliment her way, his tone easy, controlled. Li Huina blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She hadn't expected that. A small smile tugged at her lips, clearly flattered. She tilted her head, playfully suggesting they go shopping together. Han Feng didn't hesitate. Without slowing his pace, he walked past Li Huina, brushing off her offer. For a moment she stood there, caught off guard. She hadn't expected rejection. As he moved further away, realization set in. She wasn't here for him. She was here for his money. She had done it before, and he had let it happen. Not this time. His focus shifted. The Waldemar supermarket is city's largest and best stocked store in the East region. If there was one place to prepare for what was coming, it was there. A memory surfaced. In the Ice Age timeline, the supermarket had been emptied overnight. Everything, food, medicine, supplies, gone. No one ever figured out who looted it first. Back in the present, Han Feng pushed a shopping cart forward, phone in hand. He had time to stock up before disaster struck. This time, he'd be ahead of the curve. His eyes scanned an apocalypse, a survival guide on his screen. Food, medical supplies, tools, transportation, weapons. The list was long and he needed everything. Fast. Then he checked his balance. 15,357.50.
You're broke! You're fucking poor!
His excitement dimmed. This wasn't enough. He needed a solution, and fast. A notification popped up on Han Feng's phone. His eyes flickered over the screen. A loan approval. A massive amount. It clicked. He had applied for a loan before. Back then, he had been desperate, waiting for approval. Now things had changed. He scrolled through his phone, various loan apps lined up on the screen. Debt? In a world that wouldn't exist soon? He didn't have to pay anything back. World coming to an end, don't have to pay anything back. Oh right, the PPP plan with COVID, I knew this sounded familiar. Somewhere else, a can shot into the air, booted with force. Someone was not having a good day. Li Huana fumed, arms crossed. Her frustration boiling over. Han Feng rejecting her. Since when did he grow a spine? Still seething, she scoffed. What kind of man doesn't even own a car? He was pathetic, a loser. A sudden honk shattered her rant. Han Feng turned sharply, eyes locking onto an approaching vehicle. A large pickup truck rolled up in front of Li Huina. The driver leaned out, grinning, greeting her like an old friend. Li Huina's eyes widened as she got a closer look at the driver. It was Han Feng. Her gaze shifted to the pickup truck. She hesitated before asking if it was his. Han Feng nodded casually, confirming he had just bought it. For the first time, she looked impressed. Han Feng explained the situation smoothly. His dad had sent him some money before leaving for the airport. Li Huina's expression wavered, the initial excitement fading. For a moment, Han Feng thought she might lash out. But then something shifted. Li Huina's confidence cracked. She realized she had misunderstood everything. Embarrassed, she quickly apologized, her voice softer now. She had assumed too much, asking him to go shopping, thinking he was ignoring her, assuming he was ditching her for someone else. Han Feng smiled gently. There was no anger, no frustration, just quiet amusement at how flustered she had become. Without warning, he pulled her in close. Han Feng held her face gently, his touch careful but firm. His words were steady, reassuring. For a split second, Li Huina's confidence wavered. A blush crept across her cheeks. She hesitated before responding, admitting he was special to her too. The moment lingered. Then she casually suggested dinner and a movie. She waited for his response, glancing up only to find him fading into the distance. Li Huina blinked. He was gone. One moment, he was right in front of her. The next, he had vanished. A few steps away, Han Feng was already unloading his truck, arms full of boxes. His movements were hurried, his breath heavy. He grumbled at how much stuff he had bought. Nearby, Li Huina finally spotted him, her confusion turning into amusement. She stepped closer, questioning the sheer volume of his purchases. Han Feng waved it off, acting like it was nothing, just a few things he liked. Then, he suddenly remembered. A gift. He casually mentioned it, watching as Li Huina's eyes lit up instantly. Excited, eager, already imagining something extravagant. Meanwhile, his nose metaphorically stretched a playful fib, downplaying the significance. Li Huina finally said her goodbyes, carrying a box as she walked off. As she strode away, satisfaction flickered across her face. She muttered under her breath, confident in her maneuver. She had nailed that part. Han Feng exhaled, turning back to his packages. Whatever was inside, he had no intention of letting Li Huina find out. Han Feng scanned the stacks of supplies around him. These weren't just packages, they were survival. In his mind, he wasn't just preparing. He was the Grim Reaper, and when the time came, those who had wronged him would feel it. A dark glint flashed in his eyes. For the first time, he was looking forward to the apocalypse. A digital clock blinked on his screen. June 29th. Han Feng's thoughts were firm. On July 15th, the world would be buried under heavy snow, and temperatures would drop into a death trap. Outside, workers unloaded massive shipments. Time was running out. Once temperatures plummeted to 70°C, no one would be stepping outside ever again. His gaze drifted to his sealed boxes. No one could know what he was hoarding. If neighbors found out, desperation would turn them into threats. Under the cover of darkness, Han Feng moved his most sensitive supplies, taking no chances. Everything had to be secured before chaos erupted. A generator hummed to life, surrounded by fuel reserves. When the power grid collapsed, this would be the difference. He reinforced his doors and windows, sealing any weak points. Independent heating was installed, fortifying his home against the brutal cold. A single room was dedicated to supplies. Walls lined with stacked provisions, shelves filled with essentials. He was ready. Sitting on the floor, surrounded by notes and checklists, Han Feng went over his final preparations. Everything led to July 14th, the last safe day before the freeze. His eyes flicked to his checklist. Next task, understanding his abilities. If the world was going to end, he needed to know exactly what he was capable of. Han Feng stood in the kitchen, stirring absent-mindedly. The scent of cooking filled the air, but his mind wasn't on food. The Ice Age was coming. His power was a mystery, and right now he was dangerously unprepared. At the dining table, he stared at the soybeans in front of him once he had grown himself. The absurdity of it wasn't lost on him. People were going to freeze to death in a matter of weeks, and here he was, farming. Still, he had no choice. If this power was going to keep him alive, he needed to embrace it. His fingers hovered over a soybean, eyes narrowing. His power came at random, no clear pattern, no obvious trigger. It just happened, like flipping a switch he didn't even know he had. He took a deep breath and popped one into his mouth. This was the only way to test if they were safe. If he got sick, well, better now than later. The plate was empty. He had finished the meal, and more importantly, he was still alive. His stomach didn't churn, his body didn't reject it. At the very least, his power could produce edible food. That was something. Leaning back, he exhaled. But this wasn't enough. If all he could do was grow soybeans, that wouldn't get him far. He needed to push his limits. In his mind, his ability flickered giant red and green hands, shifting unpredictably. But what did they actually do? So far, he had only tested it on soybeans. That was too small. If he wanted to truly understand what he was capable of, he needed to experiment. Decision made, he pulled open the fridge. If this power had rules, he was going to find them. The hours blurred together. One test turned into another, then another. Before he knew it, the sun had dipped below the horizon. When his vision cleared, he was on the floor, a massive head of broccoli in his hands. His brain lagged, struggling to process what had happened. Had he blacked out? Slowly, he pushed himself up. The kitchen was a disaster, smashed vegetables everywhere. His head throbbed. Using his power took more out of him than he thought. It wasn't just tiring. It drained him. His body, his mind, whatever this power was, it came with a cost. That realization hit harder than expected. He wasn't invincible. Still dizzy, he reached for the rest of the soybeans, chewing slowly. At least one thing was clear: he had learned something. Even if his power was unpredictable, it was real. His gaze drifted over the counter. Scattered produce, overturned containers, remnants of his failed attempts. Before passing out, he had tested his ability on everything he could get his hands on. The results? Inconsistent. Some plants had no reaction at all. Nothing changed, nothing grew. His power wasn't universal. That was a problem. But soybeans reacted instantly. They grew faster, stronger. If he could understand why, he might be able to control this. Not every plant reacted the same way. Some didn't grow, some sprouted instantly, and some, they straight up exploded. Han Feng flinched as smoke curled from the latest disaster. What used to be a vegetable was now a pile of strange, coal-like residue. He pinched a piece between his fingers. It wasn't just ash, it had weight. A different texture. A spark. A flicker. Then heat. The black substance burned, glowing red hot. This wasn't waste. This was fuel. For the first time, a real win. Heat meant survival. No more freezing. No more worrying. That relief didn't last long. Hours passed, and every attempt to activate his power failed. Han Feng sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by shredded produce, his breath ragged. It wasn't random. There had to be a pattern. He clenched his fists. If he didn't figure this out, he might never get another chance. He forced himself to breathe. To focus, this power had rules, and he needed to learn them. A flicker of energy. A shift. Then, suddenly a fresh broccoli bloomed in his hand. His grip tightened. Finally. But something still wasn't right. His power wasn't just unpredictable, it was unstable. He sat with the fully formed broccoli, turning it over in his hands. There had to be a pattern. It wasn't just about using energy, there was a trigger. Something deeper. He had to crack the code before it was too late. A realization clicked into place. His power wasn't just physical, it was connected to his consciousness. Sitting cross-legged, Han Feng closed his eyes, pushing everything else away. If he wanted control, he had to tap into something deeper. In his mind, the world shifted. The warmth of the sun, the whisper of the wind. He stood naked in a vast forest clearing. Around him, the air felt alive. A few steps forward, and the forest responded. A deer moved toward him, calm and unafraid. Han Feng reached out, placing a hand on its head. More animals gathered, drawn to him, as if recognizing his presence as something natural. A sudden burst of green light. His vision burned white-hot as he opened his eyes. Reality snapped back. His hand pulsed with green energy, but this time it wasn't random. It was controlled. Excitement flickered across his face. A large table sat before him, stacked with various cuts of raw meat and seafood. It was time for the next experiment. Han Feng pressed his glowing green hand against a slab of raw meat. If his power could accelerate plant growth, what would it do to flesh? Nothing. The glow faded. The meat remained unchanged. Han Feng's excitement dimmed. Was his power only limited to plants? He clenched his jaw, placing his hand on another piece. Maybe it just needed time. Maybe he wasn't doing it right. He pushed harder, urging it to react. Work your magic. Han Feng exhaled sharply. Still nothing. No movement, no reaction, just raw, unresponsive meat. He sat back, analyzing his failure. During meditation, he had sensed two distinct colors, green and red. Until now, he had only used the green one. But what about the red? His fingers tightened around a fresh slab of meat. If the green wasn't working, then it was time to see what the red light could do. Focused, he commanded it internally. Show me what you've got. Instantly, the slab in his hand began to glow, pulsing with deep red energy. The surface bulged unnaturally, twisting. Then it burst. A wave of disgusting, red, gooey substance shot out, splattering across the counter.
Oh my god. Right now, I'd rather eat poodle shit than put that in my mouth.
Han Feng recoiled, his face twisted in disgust. Without hesitation, he hurled the remains away. His breathing steadied as he examined the mess. The red glow had done something. The meat had changed. He picked up a piece, noting its texture. It felt cooked. That wasn't all. This wasn't just heat, there was something more to it. The red energy wasn't just cooking the meat. It was breaking it down. Then, without warning, a glowing blue hand flickered into existence. Han Feng barely had time to process what was happening. He was holding a fully cooked piece of meat, its rawness completely gone. His eyes flickered between the glowing remnants in his palm. The red light didn't just cook, it disintegrated. Han Feng's fingers brushed over the scattered remnants of soybeans. A realization flickered in the back of his mind. His hands hovered in front of him, one pulsing green, the other red. Evolution and disintegration. Creation and destruction. Two forces opposites, yet connected. With slow precision, he pressed both glowing hands together, letting red and green energy meet. Then, he reached for the meat and the soybeans, letting the energies flow into both at once. A sudden pulse. The reaction hit instantly. Han Feng's eyes widened, something was happening. The slab of meat in his grip began to expand, its surface stretching and reshaping. But the soybeans? They were gone. Han Feng scanned the table before a theory hit him. They hadn't disappeared. They had merged. He turned the meat over in his hands. It looked different. Smoother, richer in color, almost unnaturally fresh. It didn't just grow larger, it was enhanced. Determined, he grabbed another piece. If this worked once, it could work again. But the moment he tried to replicate the process, nothing happened. Again and again, he repeated the steps. Every attempt failed. Frustration built inside him. What had gone wrong? Han Feng sighed, slumped among the failed experiments. He had made progress, but there were still too many unknowns. For now, he'd have to leave it alone. There were bigger concerns ahead. Despite the setbacks, today had been productive. He could now create meat, wheat, and broccoli, real, sustainable food. That alone put him leagues ahead of everyone else. His fingers curled into a fist. Mastering this power meant more than survival. It meant control. Power. If he played his cards right, he wouldn't just outlive the apocalypse, he would dominate it. In his mind, a superhero-like figure stood atop a snowy mountain peak, laughing triumphantly. That could be him. A world frozen in despair, and he alone holding the key to survival. And this is the exact moment delusion set in. The fantasy shattered. A vision of reality hit him cold, brutal, and unforgiving. He was defenseless. Food wouldn't be enough. He needed a weapon. Rummaging through a box, he frowned. This wasn't enough. Stockpiling food wouldn't protect him. If he wanted to survive, he needed real firepower. And soon. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily down from the sky. Han Feng stared out the window. It had started. The cold was settling in. The temperature would only drop from here. Time was running out. He walked down the snowy streets, deep in thought. A gun was the best option, but getting one wasn't easy. Illegal, expensive, and completely outside his connections. Laughter rang through the air, a voice arrogant and bragging. Han Feng's attention shifted to a nearby conversation. A rich young man boasted loudly, name-dropping Lao Wang from the Shigang Lida group as his big brother. Han Feng's eyes narrowed. That name. He recognized it. The young man casually handed a cigarette to someone, dropping more hints about his connections. Han Feng studied him, his exaggerated fashion sense, his need to impress. This guy was all talk. The man offered another cigarette, waiting for recognition, for respect. Han Feng almost laughed. He knew exactly who this was. Back in the day, this so-called big shot had another name, Homeless Joe. Han Feng introduced Li Ziyi, better known as Brother Li, a man with no fixed job yet always entangled in high-stakes deals. If there was money to be made, he was in the loop. As someone offered him a cigarette, Li Ziyi casually waved it off, only smoking a specific brand. He mentioned heading to the sauna reward for another successful contract out from a distance. Han Feng observed. Li Ziyi wasn't a traditional businessman, yet he carried himself like one. Deals, favors, and constant negotiations, he was always working, always connected. Li Ziyi spoke to his companion about finalizing a massive 20 million deal, but before the conversation could settle, another one came up with 10 million more on the table. No celebration, no hesitation, just another day. Han Feng watched closely. This was the kind of man who could make things happen. If he needed a connection, Li Ziyi might be the key. Later, amidst the swirling snow, Han Feng spotted Li Ziyi again and casually raised a hand in greeting. Li Ziyi stopped, momentarily surprised. There was something about Han Feng's smirk that seemed unusually familiar. From a distance, Li Ziyi squinted, trying to place him. There was recognition, but not enough to remember. Both men stood face to face in the snowy street. Han Feng's greeting was confident, his energy warm yet deliberate. Li Ziyi, however, remained unreadable, uncertain if this was someone from his past or just another person seeking a favor. After a brief pause, Li Ziyi admitted that he met too many people to recall them all, brushing off his lapse in memory. Still, he remained open, ready to hear what Han Feng wanted. Han Feng hesitated, gaze thoughtful as he studied Li Ziyi, who leisurely smoked his cigarette. This wasn't just a casual favor, there were layers to this conversation. Leaning in, Han Feng whispered something low enough that no one else could hear. Li Ziyi listened intently, his posture shifting slightly. A flicker of concern passed through Li Ziyi's face. Whatever Han Feng had asked for wasn't ordinary. He pressed for an explanation, questioning why Han Feng needed such an item. And for a moment, he even seemed to regret bringing it up. After a brief silence, Li Ziyi reached into his pocket, producing a small pouch. The weight of the offer was clear. He made sure Han Feng understood this wasn't something to take lightly. Weapons weren't just objects, they carried consequences. Han Feng didn't take the pouch. Instead, he calmly corrected Li Ziyi's assumption. This wasn't about reckless violence or crime. He had personal reasons, unresolved grudges that made self-defense a necessity. His mind drifted back to an incident, a time when, rushing to work, he had accidentally collided with an old man while cycling. What should have been a minor accident escalated into something far worse. The old man, instead of brushing it off or scolding him, had turned and spit directly in his face. Han Feng remembered the moment of pure disbelief, the humiliation that followed. There were lines you didn't cross, and that man had spat straight past all of them. The memory flashed. Han Feng didn't just let it slide. That day, he made sure the man learned exactly how big of a mistake he had made. The spitter, still seething, didn't take his loss lightly. Before storming off, he made his intentions clear. This wasn't over. The very next day, he proved it. Han Feng found himself ambushed, outnumbered, and beaten down. The humiliation stung just as much as the bruises. That moment had shifted something inside him. This wasn't about petty revenge, it was about never being defenseless again. He explained to Li Ziyi that the real reason he wanted a weapon was simple self-defense. Li Ziyi reacted with clear disgust, shaking his head at the sheer lack of decency in the spitter's behavior. Han Feng watched him, realizing Li Ziyi completely missed the point of his story. This wasn't about principles, it was about power. Still, Li Zi offered his support, patting Han Feng on the shoulder like they were old comrades. Apparently, this was now a team effort. With an easy confidence, Li Zi assured Han Feng that he had his back. He could call his big brother for assistance if needed. Han Feng simply nodded, accepting the offer with measured gratitude. Li Zi casually suggested they take the bus, explaining that his expensive car was in the shop. He made it sound like a minor inconvenience, brushing it off as nothing. Han Feng, without saying much, led him outside. When Li Zi saw the sleek, polished car waiting for them, his expression shifted. This wasn't just any ride, this was something impressive. As they drove, Li Zi kept glancing around, taking in the premium interior. The price of the car had him genuinely stunned. Han Feng casually revealed what he paid for it, leaving Li Zi even more impressed. With newfound enthusiasm, Li Zi took on the role of navigator, casually giving directions while grinning at his phone. Li Zi couldn't resist. He snapped a selfie in the luxury car, immediately posting it to social media. If he was riding in style, the world needed to know. Meanwhile, on a snowy street, a group of men huddled around a fire barrel, grumbling about the sudden drop in temperature. They had seen cold days before, but something felt unnatural. Their conversation slowed as they spotted someone approaching. The flickering firelight barely illuminated the figure, but it was enough to put them on edge. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing by. Li Zi rolled up in a brand new Tiger SUV, stepping out with the energy of a man who had just won the lottery. With his usual flair, he began bragging to his friends, throwing his arms out as if presenting a grand prize. Han Feng, standing nearby, simply watched. His friends wasted no time, crowding around the vehicle, eyes gleaming with admiration. The inevitable question came: how much did it cost? Li Zi, without missing a beat, casually tossed out a number: 700 grand. Han Feng took in the scene. Bold move. Claiming ownership of a car that wasn't his in front of the actual owner. He almost had to respect the audacity. So we can just yell mine now and claim ownership. Okay, got it. The setting shifted, a luxurious room, the kind only reserved for people used to money and power. Lao Wang sat there, unimpressed, as his younger brother walked in. It was late, and he made it clear Li Zi had better have a good reason for showing up. Li Zi, ever the smooth talker, offered a cigarette to his brother. Lao Wang barely glanced at it, waiting for him to get to the point. Finally, Li Zi got to business. He was here to make a request on behalf of Han Feng. A simple transaction: a gun. Han Feng sat nearby, trying to keep his nerves in check. The weight of the room, the presence of Lao Wang, it was all a little heavier than expected. Lao Wang didn't look impressed. For all this effort, it was just a lousy gun? He barely reacted, as if the request wasn't even worth his time. Without hesitation, Lao Wang called out to someone in the room. A figure emerged: Kaiying Zi, a man whose very presence carried quiet menace. His sharp gaze locked onto the two younger men as he stepped forward, awaiting orders. A moment later, a handgun was placed onto the table. Lao Wang barely spared it a glance as he named his price: 6,000. Han Feng, who had been ready to finalize the deal, paused. His gaze flickered to the weapon, then back up. 6,000 for something this small. He leaned back slightly, an idea forming. Maybe something a little longer. Han Feng leaned forward slightly, clarifying his request. A gun was one thing, but what he really needed was something with a scope. Precision mattered. The ideal weapon for personal protection: a long-range sniper rifle. Lao Wang's expression shifted. The sudden change in demand didn't sit well with him. He called Han Feng out on it, clearly irritated. For a brief moment, the irritation cracked into something else: discomfort, maybe even unease. But he masked it quickly, keeping his usual composed demeanor. Lao Wang's patience finally snapped. His voice rose as he questioned if they thought his place was a shopping mall where they could just browse and pick out whatever weapon they wanted. Before things could escalate, Li Zi stepped in, raising a hand to diffuse the tension. He explained that there was a reason behind Han Feng's specific request. The scene shifted: a snowy city street at night. The atmosphere grew heavier, setting up a different kind of conversation. Lao Wang, now in a different tone, expressed disgust over a particular situation. Something involving 3 kids, none of whom were his own. The way he spoke about it, the whole thing had infuriated him. Han Feng remained silent, but internally he was beginning to question just how many absurd stories he'd have to sit through. Eventually, Lao Wang refocused. The sniper rifle request? He could make it happen. It wouldn't be instant, but he assured Han Feng it would be arranged in a few days. Han Feng gave a measured nod, thanking him for accepting the deal. Without hesitation, Lao Wang turned to Kaiying Zi, giving the final order. The rifle, the ammo, everything needed to be prepped. It would be set to semi-automatic, ensuring versatility. Kang Ye complied without question, moving quickly. Meanwhile, Li Zi confirmed the deal had gone through. The speed and efficiency of it all was unsettling. Han Feng had gotten exactly what he wanted, but now, the real weight of his choice settled in. Just as Han Feng was about to leave, Lao Wang suddenly called out to him. There was something else. Without ceremony, Lao Wang extended a pistol toward Han Feng. A gift, an unexpected weighty gesture. Han Feng took a long look at the weapon. Guns weren't just tools, they were statements. He weighed the offer carefully. For the first time, hesitation flickered across Han Feng's face. He addressed Lao Wang with measured respect, choosing his words carefully. A vibration from his phone broke the moment. Han Feng checked the screen concerning news. Reports of abnormal weather patterns, dwindling supplies, warnings to stock up before shortages hit. Lao Wang's expression shifted. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just paranoia. He could see the writing on the wall. Han Feng, meanwhile, kept his expression unreadable. Lao Wang finally acknowledged that the situation was serious. Whether he liked it or not, things were about to change. Deciding it was time to go, Han Feng and Li Ziyi made their exit. Lao Wang, already irritated, waved them off, snapping at them to get lost. As they walked down the street, Han Feng glanced at Li Ziyi, genuinely appreciative. The situation could have gone sideways, but Li Ziyi handled it well. As a gesture of thanks, he offered to buy him cigarettes. Li Ziyi waved off the need for repayment but made it clear if Han Feng was buying, he wanted a very specific brand. Han Feng laughed, agreeing without hesitation, even suggesting they hit the sauna once his next payday came in. Finally, the tension of the night had started to ease. With his supplies secured and weapons in place, Han Feng mentally checked off his preparations. Everything was lining up. All that was left was to focus on refining his abilities. The apocalypse was coming, and he intended to be ready. Then, before he could take another step forward, he slipped. His foot shot out from under him, sending him crashing onto the ice platform below. Li Ziyi rushed over immediately, eyes wide. Han Feng was sprawled on the ground, clutching his leg. Pain radiated through Han Feng's body as he groaned. This wasn't just a bruise, his leg might actually be broken. Still on the ground, half buried in the snow, Han Feng gritted his teeth and told Li Ziyi to get him. Li Ziyi hesitated before revealing something that made the situation worse: he didn't have a driver's license. There was no way he could drive them there. Thinking quickly, Li Ziyi wrapped an arm around Han Feng, helping him up. If he couldn't drive, then at least he could support him while they walked. After just a few steps, it was obvious this wasn't going to work. Moving with an injured leg in the snow was impossible. Li Ziyi shifted tactics, suggesting they grab a taxi instead. At the hospital, inside an office, a nurse was finishing up paperwork. As she gathered her things to leave, she turned to her colleague Jian, preparing for her night shift. With a friendly nod, the nurse reminded Jian to be careful in this weather. Jian returned the sentiment, watching her leave. Now alone, Jian glanced at the window. The snowstorm outside was worsening. Thicker, heavier. Something about it felt different, almost unnatural. The quiet office was suddenly disrupted by the sharp ring of a telephone. Jian picked up, listening as a request came through. A staff shortage. They needed extra hands in the hall. With a sigh, she acknowledged the call and made her way out. Han Feng stared at the x-ray results as the doctor delivered the verdict of fractured tibia. Out of all times for this to happen, it had to be right before the apocalypse. The recommendation was simple: stay for an hour, get observed, grab the meds. But all he could think about was how much time he was losing. Now stuck in the waiting room, he sat slumped in a chair, crutches propped against the wall. His plans for survival had been derailed by gravity and bad luck. Li Ziyi, always quick to move, gave a few parting words before stepping away. The guy wasn't wasting a second sticking around. Han Feng barely acknowledged it, more focused on the mess his situation had become. With Li Ziyi gone, Han Feng let out a breath and accepted his fate. This was his life now, trapped in a hospital waiting. The hospital wasn't just busy, it was overflowing. The sudden blizzard and plummeting temperatures had turned the place into a madhouse. Everywhere he looked, people crowded the hallways, seeking warmth, shelter, or medical attention. Time passed slowly. Too slowly. Han Feng watched the chaotic flow of patients and staff, wondering just how long it would take to get his medication. His thoughts drifted as someone caught his attention: a nurse, moving through the room with practiced efficiency. Something about her presence drew his focus. Another nurse hurried over, informing the head nurse Jian about a patient's condition. Without hesitation, she moved to assess the situation. Jian handled the examination with sharp precision, issuing instructions without breaking stride. Every movement was calculated, every decision swift. Han Feng observed in silence, taking in her efficiency, her composure, her skill. Young, but completely in control. The kind of person who thrived in chaos. Impressive. Jian moved with a practiced ease, seamlessly transitioning from medical professionalism to gentle kindness. She crouched down, handing a teddy bear to a small child, her voice calm and reassuring. Han Feng continued watching, noting the stark contrast between her sharp efficiency and her soft compassion. His focus lingered. At first it was admiration for her skill, but then he couldn't help but notice something else. The way she interacted, the way she smiled, the way she crouched to meet the child's gaze, she really was pretty. It wasn't just a passing observation anymore. That thought settled, but then another came with it. Attractive, sure, but maybe a little too naive for her own good. Before the thought could go any further, a voice cut through the hospital noise. An old man calling for Jaeon's attention. Han Feng's eyes flicked toward him, already sensing something was off. Jeon, ever the professional, responded without hesitation. She assured him she'd be there shortly, balancing urgency and patience. Once she reached him, she offered a quick apology. Short-staffed, overworked, she didn't have the time to linger. But the man wasn't interested in logistics. His complaint: back pain, aches, the usual. Or at least, that's what it seemed like. As Jian leaned in, the old man shifted just slightly enough to snap a hidden photo. Han Feng's expression didn't change, but internally something clicked. So that's what this was. Unaware, Jian remained focused on her job. She explained that an X-ray was the best course of action. Professional. Unbothered. Han Feng, watching from the side, felt something else: irritation. The old man wasn't interested in proper medical procedure. He pressed further, insisting she take a look immediately. He even offered to show her exactly where it hurt. Han Feng's expression darkened slightly. This guy wasn't even trying to be subtle. Han Feng didn't waste words. With the old man's phone in hand, he turned the screen toward him. There it was. The evidence. The upskirt photo of Jian. There was no denying it now. As the old man reached for the phone, Han Feng tilted it just out of reach, his expression unreadable. He made it clear if this guy ever showed his face again, that picture would be posted for the whole world to see. The old man froze, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He wanted to fight back, but Han Feng had him trapped. Without another word, he turned and walked away fast. Not even pretending to be injured anymore. Jian, still processing everything, made a move to follow, but he was already gone. Han Feng watched the whole thing, amused and a little baffled. She really hadn't noticed. Not the phone, not the guy's behavior, nothing. She seemed more concerned about his sudden burst of energy. He didn't let her stay confused for long. Calmly, he laid it out: the old man had been recording her, and she had never even noticed. Jian's face shifted instantly: shock, realization, disbelief. Han Feng held up the phone again, giving her a choice: delete it or call the police. Either way, she needed to be more careful. This kind of thing wasn't just bad luck, it was avoidable. Before Jian could respond, her gaze dropped, her focus shifted. Then, suddenly, she asked something completely unrelated. His ankle, was it injured? A curtain swung back, revealing Han Feng's immediate and unfiltered response: absolute agony. Jian wasn't being gentle with her examination, and it showed. Ignoring his suffering, she finished bandaging his ankle with calm, precise movements. Her professionalism hadn't wavered once. With the wrapping done, Jian stepped back, asking if he felt any pain. The only thing he felt now was mild embarrassment. He muttered a thanks, brushing off the moment. Jian, still carrying that same energetic resolve, insisted that she should be the one thanking Han Feng for stepping in. If she ever saw that old creep again, she'd punch him real good. Han Feng barely reacted. If she was that confident, she should probably start by being aware of her surroundings. Before he could say anything else, she shifted, pressing just a little too close. Han Feng froze. His face burned slightly as he tried to ignore the fact that his injured ankle was now being sandwiched between something soft. Awareness was definitely not her strong suit. A voice called out, breaking the moment. Another nurse was calling for Jian. There was another patient that needed her attention. Without hesitation, she turned to go, already slipping back into professional mode. Before leaving, she reminded Han Feng to return in a week for a checkup. He nodded, agreeing, though he wasn't exactly thrilled about waiting that long. 1 week. That's how long he'd have to sit on the sidelines, waiting for progress. It felt like an eternity, especially with the apocalypse looming. As he stepped out of the hospital, a strange thought crossed his mind: he probably wouldn't see Jian again. Not that it should matter, but still, it felt like an odd way to part ways. The next morning, the city was buried under heavy snowfall. Thick layers of white covered the streets, turning everything into a frozen wasteland. Suddenly, every channel was interrupted. An urgent weather update took over the screen: a sharp drop in temperatures was coming within the next 24 hours. The entire country was about to be hit. The news reports flashed between maps, global temperatures crashing at an alarming rate. Even places that never saw winter, Egypt, Dubai, the Amazon, were freezing. Experts were scrambling, trying to make sense of it. The United Nations was now involved. Despite the chaos, the news anchors tried to keep everyone calm. Officials assured the public that this was just temporary. No need to panic. No need to hoard supplies. The camera cut to a man casually relaxing by a fireplace, completely unbothered. Han Feng sat watching the broadcast, silent as he took a slow sip of liquor. The reporter continued to urge people to stay calm, trust the government, and ignore any rumors. Han Feng didn't need rumors to tell him what was coming. The people on screen could pretend everything was fine all they wanted, he knew better. Han Feng, just wear a mask and it will only be 2 weeks to stop the spread, right? Han Feng leaned back, arms crossed, expression bored but unsurprised. The government's reassurances were almost laughable. If he hadn't already died once and been reborn, maybe he'd believe them. Maybe. But unlike the rest of the country, he was ready. The camera panned over his stockpile of supplies, food, medicine, generators, fuel. His home was reinforced, independently heated, and untouched by the panic settling in outside. As another warning flashed across the screen, Han Feng casually swirled a glass of wine in his hand. The world outside was spiraling into chaos, but for now, his fortress of preparation held strong. His phone vibrated relentlessly. Checking the notifications, he scrolled through a housing complex group chat. The residents were panicking. June snowfall deep, relentless, freezing. Nobody had ever seen anything like this. Then, a new message appeared. A mysterious user entered the chat, their tone different from the rest. They didn't ask questions, they didn't express shock. They simply announced one thing: this wasn't just a snowstorm. This was the beginning of an Ice Age apocalypse. Han Feng's relaxed demeanor shifted. The words hit differently. Not because he didn't already know disaster was coming, but because this person did too. Han Feng's eyes lingered on the last message in the group chat. Ice Age apocalypse. The words replayed in his mind. Was this person fearmongering, or did they actually know something? Either way, the timing was unsettling. The conversation in the neighborhood group chat took a predictable turn: complaints. The streets were buried, the snow hadn't been plowed, and no one could get to the supermarket. One resident pointed out the obvious: even if they left, driving was impossible. The entire city was freezing over. The scene shifted, but not to reality. Instead, the digital group chat visualized itself as a bizarre, surreal meeting space populated by anthropomorphic cat-like creatures. Their fur fluffed up from frustration, they gathered in the center of the imaginary complex, ready to voice their grievances. A particularly irritated cat resident stomped forward, demanding an explanation from the property managers. Why hadn't the snow been cleared? What was the point of paying for property management if they couldn't even handle this? The cat-like authority figure stood in front of the crowd, looking equally helpless. They explained it wasn't that they weren't trying, but the storm was relentless. No amount of plowing could keep up with the snowfall. The crowd wasn't having it. If the management couldn't clear the snow, then what was the point of their fees? Refunds were demanded. Justifications were ignored. The frustration in the air thickened. Among them, one cat-shaped figure remained silent. Han Feng, now depicted in his own flying form, watched the chaos unfold. Internally, he already knew this meeting was pointless. No amount of shouting was going to change the fact that this storm was beyond human control. Then, a voice cut through the noise. Someone from the back of the crowd commanded them to stop fighting. The speaker, Zhang Shuwu, one of the more level-headed residents, stepped forward. He pointed out the obvious truth: the snow wasn't just a local inconvenience. This storm was too intense, and arguing wouldn't make it any easier to clear. Cooperation would have been the better approach from the start. Zhang Shu continued, addressing the crowd's misdirected anger. The property managers were humans, not gods. They weren't in control of natural disasters, and no amount of complaining would change that. Right now, their frustration was doing nothing but finding the nearest target to lash out at. Zhang Shu's words weren't met with agreement. Instead, suspicion crept in. Some of the cat people questioned his authority. Who was he to tell them what to do? Was he siding with property management? Was he one of them? Zhang Shu didn't flinch. He wasn't here to defend management, just pointing out reality. Screaming at people who couldn't change the situation was pointless. The real question wasn't who to blame, it was how to move forward. The crowd paused. For all their frustration, they had no real alternative. They demanded an answer. If yelling wasn't going to fix things, then what would? Zhang Shu laid out a suggestion: walking to the supermarket. But he immediately countered his own idea. The roads were barely visible, the snow was too deep, and without clearing a path, it would be too dangerous. If they wanted to go, they had to work for it. Han Feng watched from the sidelines, unbothered. He remembered Zhang Shu from his past life, a guy who was always full of energy, even in the worst situations. No surprise he was taking charge here too. But Han Feng had his limits. Enough talking. If people wanted to go outside so badly, they could grab a shovel. If not, they needed to shut up. The weight of the situation finally hit him. He was going to have to shovel snow manually, and he absolutely hated that. Before anyone could grab a shovel, a weather alert popped up on their devices. The snowstorm wasn't letting up anytime soon. Then, stepping forward, an anthropomorphic black cat made an announcement. They had to leave soon for a business deal, but before they did, they were willing to help with a task. Han Feng's ears twitched. Something about that voice, the way they spoke, it felt oddly familiar. More of the animal people stepped up, agreeing to help with the task. Some wanted to buy food, others just wanted something to do. A small, light brown cat suddenly perked up. She looked suspiciously familiar, head nurse Jian, but in feline form. She enthusiastically volunteered despite admitting she wasn't the strongest. A bright orange cat stepped forward, Li Huina. Despite recently being ill, she volunteered to join. Han Feng raised an eyebrow. She was sick not too long ago, and now she was suddenly offering to shovel snow. Something wasn't adding up. A few male characters in the group immediately rushed to her side, full of concern. Huina shouldn't be out in the cold, and Li Huina especially needed to rest. Li Huina, ever the smooth talker, flashed a smile. She appreciated their concern but assured them she'd be fine. She didn't need to do the heavy lifting, they could handle the cleaning. Han Feng's finger hovered over his phone screen. With a single press, he hit the back button. Now back in the real world, Han Feng sat on his couch, scrolling through his phone. He barely needed to think about it. Li Huina was absolutely putting on an act. His phone vibrated. A new message notification. The screen flashed a message from Li Huina. She was asking where he was and complaining that he hadn't contacted her. Another message followed. A request. Since he was going to visit, he should pick up some groceries for her. And then, the final touch, a photo. Li Huina, sitting on her bed, wearing something far too suggestive to be casual. Back on the couch, Han Feng exhaled through his nose. This was classic. She wasn't just making him run errands, she was dressing it up as something else entirely. He tapped his fingers against the phone, contemplating his next move. Then, slowly, a smirk formed. An idea. A foot slams down, glass splintering beneath the weight. The phone flickers its last breath. Someone stands over it, anger rolling off them in waves. Han Feng won't get away with this. The snow just keeps coming. 3 days straight. 20 doxy. The city's buried, but no one seems to care. As long as the internet's up and the heat's running, life carries on. Online, people are dancing, laughing, doing challenges like nothing's changed. A frozen world outside, but inside their screens, it's business as usual. Han Feng scrolls through it all, barely reacting. If this is how people handle the apocalypse, maybe it's not the cold that'll take them out first. No lie, I'd probably be recapping the apocalypse myself, so I can't even get mad at them. His leg aches beneath the bandages. Months, they told him. Months before he could move freely again. But time isn't the problem. The silence is. Loneliness sits heavier than the cold, creeping in through the cracks. A video plays. A man falls from the 15th floor. Bones should break, flesh should tear. But they don't. His body repairs itself right before their eyes. The clip ends. No explanation, just a question. Real or fake? Follow for part 2. Han Feng's grip tightens around the phone. If that's possible, then maybe he doesn't have to wait. Maybe he doesn't have to be stuck. A soft hum vibrates through the air as green light flickers to life in his palm. He's about to test a theory. The energy pulses, then he slams his hand onto his injured leg. A warmth spreads beneath his palm. Healing? Han Feng waits. 1 second, then 2. His leg still hurts, exactly the same as before. He presses his fingers into the bandages, hoping maybe he just needs a moment for it to kick in, but no, nothing's changed. His shoulders sink. So, that's it? He thought he was onto something and that this power meant something, but all he did was waste time. This is my life in a nutshell. Han Feng sinks into the couch, his body heavy with exhaustion. The pain lingers, a dull reminder that his power isn't what he thought. His mind spins, looping through the same thought. If this can't heal me, then what is it really for? His breath slows, his eyes flutter shut. The weight of uncertainty fades, slipping into something softer. Sleep takes him before he can fight it. A white goat bleats in the distance. The sound is sharp, insistent, as if calling out to something unseen. Han Feng's voice rings through the air, filled with excitement, triumph, far from the frustration of reality. He isn't on the ground anymore. He rides a massive white goat, soaring through the sky, a herd of others following in information. Wind rushes past, the world stretching wide below. A Native American-style headdress rests on his head, feathers shifting with every gust. His arms spread wide, embracing the moment. Somewhere deep in the dream, he shouts with conviction, "It's time for the sheep to take a walk." A flock of large, winged, goat-like creatures flies through the sky. More of them drift nearby, moving together. Han Feng rides one of the sheep, grinning as the whole flock follows behind him. Suddenly, he loses balance. His grip slips, and he tumbles off the sheep, sent flying through the air. He crashes onto the ground, landing hard. One leg bends at an awkward angle as he lies there, gasping. A small goat walks over and licks his foot. I guess flying a sheep isn't as easy as it looks. Han Feng shoves the goat's head away, still trying to catch his breath. The goat stares at him, its eyes narrow, its expression shifting, almost like it's offended. Without warning, its tongue shoots out, wrapping tight around Han Feng's injured leg. The tongue pulls, yanking his leg straight up into the air. A soft green glow spreads from the goat's tongue, seeping into Han Feng's leg through the bandages. Han Feng's eyes snap open. His body jerks upright as he wakes up in shock. He sits on the edge of the sofa, sweating, still shaken from the dream. But as he looks down, his expression changes. His foot is glowing. Beneath the bandages, green light flickers, tendrils of energy shifting underneath, just like in the dream. Han Feng unwraps the bandages, his movements careful. He slowly shifts his weight onto his injured leg, testing it. There's no resistance, no pain. The injury's completely gone. He stands there, letting the realization sink in. His gaze lingers on his leg. The green glow from the dream. Could it have actually healed him? His fingers curl around a knife. There's only one way to know for sure. He drags the blade across his finger, slow and deliberate. A sharp sting follows, the wound splitting open as blood wells up. His breath hitches, but he forces himself to watch. Then it happens. The wound flares with green light, the energy spreading instantly, knitting the skin back together in seconds. Han Feng grins. The pain is gone. The wound is gone. This is it. He's figured out the trigger. Outside, a group of people work together, shoveling snow as they prepare to move a heavy log out of the way. A man in a long coat, Jiang Shuyu, steps forward, acknowledging the effort. His attention shifts to an older man, Uncle Lu, expressing appreciation for his help. Liu Guangyao, known as Uncle Lu, shakes his head, downplaying his role. He gestures toward two younger men nearby, pointing out that the Jin brothers handled most of the work. The Jin brothers, Jin Qinwen and Jin Qinwu, exchange looks, clearly pleased with the recognition. Nearby, a girl in a pink snowsuit steps forward, only for her foot to slip on the icy ground. The Jin brothers react instantly, moving toward the fallen girl. They warn her about the ice, their movements quick but careful. One of them reaches down, gripping her hand firmly, helping her back onto her feet. Now standing, Jin Xian brushes the snow off her coat, bundled tightly in her pink winter clothes. She reassures them, her voice light as she thanks them for the assist. Xian waves off their concern, insisting she can handle the snow clearing herself. The brothers nod before heading off toward the main path, offering to help if she ever needs it. Nearby, Jiang Shuyu shifts the conversation, bringing up the snowfall. It's getting heavier, and gathering supplies needs to be done quickly and efficiently. Liu Guangya listens, then adds something about the supply situation, his tone carrying a hint of concern. Jiang Shuyu glances over, picking up on the hesitation. He asks what's on his mind. Liu Guangya hesitates before speaking, downplaying the concern as if it's not a big deal. Eventually, he explains. He's heard that someone nearby has been bringing in large amounts of supplies, loading and unloading them from a small truck, almost like they're moving. Jiang Shuyu considers the information. Could just be a new neighbor or home renovations, nothing unusual. But Liu Guangyao isn't so sure. He's noticed gas tanks and a fireplace being set up in the area. Not exactly the kind of preparation someone new to the neighborhood would be making. Something about it feels off. The Jin brothers, shovels in hand, call out to Jiang Shuyu, letting him know that the main path is finally clear. Liu Guangyao nods in approval, acknowledging their effort. Before they can move on, a newcomer approaches, catching their attention. Their conversation about winter preparation seems to intrigue the stranger, but before they can respond, a snowball comes flying in from behind, smacking the newcomer. A woman, Liu Yan, wastes no time scolding Wu Chuanyu, calling him out for slacking off. Her expression leaves no room for argument. Wu Kuan-yu turns to defend himself, brushing off the accusation and bragging about his contributions. Liu Yan isn't having it. She fires back, pointing out that he's done nothing but stand around while the others have actually worked. The Jin brothers glance at each other, unsure whether to step in or just let it play out. Before the argument can escalate, Jiang Shuyu steps forward, cutting through the tension. His presence alone is enough to make them stop, his tone leaving no room for debate. The moment shifts as Jin Xian claps her hands together, her voice bright with excitement. It's time to head to the supermarket for supplies. The others quickly agree. There's no time to waste. As they start planning, Jin Qinwu brings up the sheer amount of supplies they need to buy. Jin Qinwen, already thinking ahead, mentions sending a message to their mother about grabbing extra essentials. The conversation drifts back to the snowstorm. Liu Guangyao turns to Jiang Shuyu, asking for his take on the situation. Is this storm just a rough patch, or is it tied to something bigger? Jiang Shuyu listens, his expression thoughtful. After a pause, Jiang Shuyu shrugs off the concern. The storm isn't something he's worried about. He explains his reasoning. It won't last. The snow will pass soon enough, and life will go back to normal. He sees no reason to assume it's part of anything larger. But even if the storm does persist, he adds, having someone in the neighborhood stocked with resources could actually work in their favor. Liu Guanyao nods, agreeing with the logic. He muses that younger people always seem to think things through in ways his generation wouldn't. The city stretches out under a thick blanket of white. Snowfall continues in waves, covering buildings and streets, the storm showing no signs of stopping. Standing with an umbrella in hand, Qiangshu calls out to the group, urging them to line up properly. They need to move quickly and return within 3 hours. People move through the deep snow, their footsteps slow and heavy. The cold air hangs thick around them as they push forward. Elsewhere, snow drifts past the lit window of an apartment building. Fang's place. Then, suddenly, a loud noise. A sharp thud breaks the silence from inside. Han Feng jerks awake, eyes squinting against the dim light. A voice filters in through the door, calling him little brother. He groans in response, still half asleep. Still drowsy, he rubs his face, muttering an apology. He must have dozed off without realizing it. The voice belongs to Li Zi, known as Brother Li. Li Zi steps inside, getting straight to the point. He's brought the weapon Han Feng asked for, a semi-automatic, neatly packed in its case. Li Zi hands over a long bag to Han Feng, the weight of it unmistakable. Inside, the weapon. Han Feng takes it, nodding in appreciation. Li Zi is always prepared. He comments on it, calling him too polite, almost amused by the formality. Li Zi takes a long drag from his cigarette, his breathing heavy. The way his shoulders move catches Han Feng's attention, prompting him to ask if he's all right. Without answering directly, Li Zi shifts the conversation. He asks if Han Feng has heard about the supermarket in the East District. Apparently, they cleared the snow to reach it, only to find it completely empty. Someone had looted the entire place overnight. Han Feng's expression shifts. This wasn't what he expected to hear. His concern grows. Looting incidents? Even now, he thought things had settled, but it seems like people are still taking risks, just to stockpile supplies. Li Zi he doesn't linger on the topic. He exhales smoke into the cold air and tells Han Feng to dress warmly before stepping away. He's heading out. Han Feng nods, adjusting his grip on the bag. He tells Li Zi he goodbye, watching as he disappears into the distance. Back inside, Han Feng steps into the room, closing the door behind him. The weapon is in his hands now. His mind lingers on the empty supermarket. It doesn't make sense. Who could have cleared out everything so quickly? Even a large group wouldn't be able to work that fast. A thought crosses his mind. Could a superhuman with dimensional abilities be responsible? Someone who could bypass obstacles, slip in and out without being seen? The idea unsettles him. His fingers tighten around his palm. A green energy flickers from his hand, responding to his thoughts. If something like that exists, it's a problem. Han Feng leans back on the couch, flipping open a book. If superhumans with strange abilities exist, he needs countermeasures. The best way to start? Understanding his own powers. His notes spread across the pages, filled with scribbled observations. Size manipulation, quantity control. His ability works best on food. Soybeans, broccoli, wheat, pork. But the results? Inconsistent. He plucks a single soybean from the bowl, rolling it between his fingers. The success rate has been low, especially with canned meat. Those tests failed tenfold compared to soybeans. The pattern doesn't make sense. He focuses, channeling energy into the failed soybean. Nothing happens. Confusion settles in. Why isn't it working this time? Before he can think further, a sudden burst of energy explodes in his palm. Frustration flickers across his face as he clenches his fist around a newly formed solid mass. His control over this ability is still a gamble. He exhales, tightening his grip. If he wants to rely on this power, he needs to understand it fully. No more random results. He crushes the object in his palm, determined to figure this out. After countless failures, a single success. In his hands, a healthy, thriving soybean plant. The first real sign that his power can be controlled. Exhaustion settles in, but Han Feng lets out a sigh of relief. Finally, he's starting to get the hang of this. He turns the plant over in his palm, taking a moment to appreciate the victory. His expression shifts, more thoughtful now. The energy from the green light isn't constant. Each time he uses it, the output feels different. Carefully observing the plant, he notices a pattern. Different food items seem to require different amounts of energy. Some absorb the power effortlessly, while others resist it completely. A realization clicks into place. A single misstep means failure. The technique isn't just about power, it's about precision. And then something familiar about the process hits him. He's seen this kind of energy input before, in an online dancing game from years ago. It's just like the rhythm mechanics from that game. The energy values line up like directional input keys, each movement requiring perfect timing. Testing his theory, he channels his power again. This time, he doesn't just hope it works, he controls it. Sitting still, he focuses inward. The green glow radiates from his chest, pulsing in rhythm with his breath. Mastering this ability isn't about strength. It's about timing. The energy flows perfectly. The plant in his hands thrives instantly. A surge of excitement rushes through him. He's done it. Now that he's figured out plants, it's time for the real challenge. He heads to the kitchen, ready to experiment on meat. His first attempt fails miserably. The meat melts into a black, disgusting liquid exactly as he feared. But he doesn't hesitate. If it worked on plants, it should work on meat too. It's determined. He picks up a chicken leg. He just has to apply the same principles. Han Feng steadies his breath, focusing his energy on the chicken leg in his hands. The green glow flickers, shifting as he tries to grasp the exact energy values needed. Something feels off. Unlike vegetables, the process takes longer. The energy doesn't absorb as easily. Before he can adjust, the chicken leg erupts into black goo, splattering across his hands. He tries again, misses the mark. The energy flickers. Another failure. Again. Wrong timing. Again. Still wrong. Frustration builds with every failed attempt, his patience wearing thin. Finally, he snaps. His voice echoes through the room as he yells at no one in particular, frustrated at how ridiculously difficult this is. Han Feng is basically getting bullied by raw meat. No diddy outside, the dark snowfall drifts past the window. Inside, his kitchen is a disaster, black goo splattered everywhere, a scene of repeated failures. Han Feng stares at yet another failed attempt. He examines the meat in his hands, searching for what he keeps doing wrong. There has to be a way to make this work. Closing his eyes, he takes a deep breath. His hands begin to glow again, but this time, he shifts his mindset. Instead of forcing it, he imagines himself playing that old rhythm game. The energy flow isn't about brute force, it's about timing. The pulse of the energy aligns. He feels it, just like a perfect beat drop in a game. He pushes forward, yelling as he hits the exact moment. With a final motion, he tosses the meat onto the ground, body tense, breath heavy. The exhaustion is setting in. Then he sees it. For the first time, it worked. The process is complete. Satisfaction settles in. He's finally perfected the technique. Han Feng collapses onto the floor, arms sprawled out. Groaning softly, he stares at the ceiling. After countless attempts, exhaustion has finally caught up to him. Despite his body feeling like it's been through a battle, a faint sense of satisfaction lingers. He's figured it out. The method to activate meat enhancement is now clear. The screen flickers, a news broadcast. A reporter announces that this is now the third day of the severe snowstorm. Stormy road across the entire country, the situation is being called the worst snowstorm of the century. Han Feng lies on the couch, eyes fixed on the TV. The broadcast details government measures being taken to maintain basic living standards during the crisis. The news report continues, warning of widespread infrastructure failures. Utilities are breaking down across multiple regions. Residents are advised to stay put and wait for government support to restore services. The reporter urges citizens to stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. Han Feng listens, unfazed. He's seen this before, in his past life. Then, a notification pops up on his phone. A new group message. Han Feng skims through the chat. The first message comes from someone in Unit 1701, complaining that their calls to the government aren't getting through. His brows furrow. Scrolling further, he sees another complaint, this time from a resident in Unit 1202. They're frustrated, questioning why no further updates have been provided. At the Happy Housing Complex, a group of anthropomorphic cats argue amongst themselves. Han Feng notices how some seem calmly waiting for help, while others are growing restless, thinking about how to handle things themselves. Suddenly, a new voice cuts through the debate. A single question. Do you all really believe in the news? Everyone turns, eyes locking onto the source. Standing at the edge of the group, Uncle Lu, an older, weathered creature, steps forward. His expression is grim. He doesn't trust the official reports. If things were truly under control, he argues, why hasn't anyone seen actual support arriving? Uncle Lu continues, no military vehicles, no supply trucks, no movement towards City A. Something isn't adding up. If anything, this feels like the lead up to something much worse. A hush falls over the group. The realization seeps in like a slow chill. Some exchange uneasy glances while others shift uncomfortably. The fear is setting in. If Uncle Lu is right, this isn't just about the snowstorm. This could be the start of something much bigger. At Happy Housing Complex, a large assembly of anthropomorphic animal residents gathers. The air is heavy with tension. Talks of war have begun circulating. Murmurs spread through the crowd, concern and fear growing. Someone speaks up, uncertain of what they're supposed to do now. Han Feng listens, but his mind drifts elsewhere. He's seen this before. In his previous life, moments like these played out just as chaotically. Jiang Xuyu steps forward, his expression firm. The situation is serious. Sitting around and waiting isn't an option. They need to act now to protect themselves. His tone sharpens as he lays out the reality. Some people in the neighborhood are already struggling with food shortages. Government aid? There's no telling when or if it will arrive. They can't afford to wait. He presents a solution: sharing supplies. Those with extra should donate to those in need. To lead by example, he offers half of his own food. The crowd falls silent. Some seem moved by his generosity, others concerned. A few exchange uncertain glances. A debate breaks out. Wu Kuanyo speaks up, discussing communal support. He suggests a formal donation drive, but not everyone is convinced. Tension rises when Li Huaina is singled out. Wu Kuanyo directly asks her to contribute, but the question stirs old resentments. Past refusals and accusations resurface. Someone in the group apologizes. They'd contribute if they could, but they barely have enough for themselves. Another suggests asking others, emphasizing the importance of collective responsibility. Despite the initial skepticism, something shifts. One by one, people step up. The hesitation fades, replaced by a growing sense of solidarity. Soon, the community is working together. Food, medicine, clothing, all kinds of aid are being offered. The donation effort has taken shape. The community comes together, setting up an organized system to manage the aid and supplies. Jiang Xiu thanks everyone for making the donation effort a reality and proposes that the building owners should oversee distribution. With that, he officially forms the Interim Owners Committee, a group responsible for managing and distributing the collected supplies. Han Feng leans back, watching. He's seen this before. In his past life, this committee wasn't as noble as it seemed. What started as a system for order became a way to control people's resources. Meanwhile, the temperature plummets to 40 degrees. Heavy snowfall buries the city under an unforgiving freeze. Central heating fails and people are desperate to stay warm. Han Feng already knows it will get worse. For everyone except him. Lost in thought, Han Feng is suddenly jerked back to reality by the loud ring of his phone. He nearly drops his controller, frantically button mashing to pause his zombie apocalypse game before answering. On the other end, a voice informs him that roads are being cleared due to the snowstorm. Han Feng lowers the phone, irritation creeping in. The urgency in their voice is pointless. The roads? Already buried again within hours. Now in the building's lobby, Han Feng gazes outside. Snowfall continues, burying everything in sight. His mind drifts. Keeping his distance from the others is the best way to protect his secret. The sheer weight of the overnight snowfall has created a problem. The entire ground floor entrance is completely blocked. The neighbors gather by the doors, staring out at the massive snowdrift trapping them inside. Some discuss possible solutions, while others suggest simply pushing the door open. A neighbor turns to Han Feng, asking for his help. He hesitates before reluctantly agreeing. The group presses against the door, their movements coordinated. The weight of the snow traps them inside, forcing them to push with everything they've got. Finally, the door bursts open, only for an unstoppable wall of wind and ice to blast through. A blizzard of epic proportions rages outside, the sheer force catching everyone off guard. The cold is unbearable, the wind howls, snow pelting their faces. The neighbors recoil, struggling to stand against the relentless storm. Han Feng huddles into himself, shivering violently. His body protests against the biting chill. He knew it was cold, but this feels like death creeping in. His thoughts spiral. Frostbite, hypothermia, maybe worse. Back inside, the group retreats from the storm, gathering around to discuss their next move. Someone mutters that only a complete idiot would go outside in this. As if on cue, a confident, booming voice cuts through the tension. Han Feng freezes. He knows that voice. Li Ziyi steps forward. His presence dominates the room, his posture exuding confidence. He scans the group before shaking his head. Cowards. Why are they so afraid of the snow? The neighbors exchange worried glances. This isn't bravery, it's recklessness. They urge Li Ziyi to think rationally before stepping outside. Li Ziyi doesn't even acknowledge their concerns. He takes a slow drag from his cigarette, the ember glowing against the freezing air. Then, without warning, he launches himself into the blizzard. A battle cry rips through the storm as he barrels forward, shoveling and clearing snow with pure brute force. The storm rages around him, but Li Ziyi doesn't falter. He keeps going, yelling like a warrior on a battlefield. With every swing, he slams through the snowdrifts, refusing to back down. The neighbors watch in stunned amazement as Li Ziyi carves a path through the snow like a one-man army. Li Ziyi writes away. It shouldn't be possible, but he's doing it. Then, suddenly, his voice cuts through the wind. He's calling for help. By the time they reach him, he's coughing violently, his body trembling from the cold. The doors slam shut behind them as they drag him back inside. Li Ziyi collapses onto the floor, gasping for breath. The others rush to his side, their concern growing. Han Feng steps forward, watching closely. He asks if Li Ziyi can even stand. Steadying himself, Han Feng turns to the group. They need a plan. First, they need to head to the car park and find whoever is in charge. Once the storm settles, they can decide what happens next. Storm isn't letting up. The snowfall rages harder, piling higher, the winds threatening to bury everything. This is beyond what manpower alone can handle. A man walks toward the parking garage entrance, his movements slow but deliberate. Whether he's looking for shelter or someone else, it's unclear. Jiang Suyu steps forward, addressing the gathered crowd. His voice is steady, controlled. The plan is simple. Once the storm calms, they'll clear the snow together. Until then, they'll use the basement car park as the main donation collection point. Han Feng's eyes narrow as he spots Jiang. The surname, he's seen it before. The crowd listens intently, hanging on Jiang's every word, but Han Feng isn't listening. He's focused on Jiang Shuyu, the man behind the so-called relief efforts. Jiang Shuyu smiles, thanking everyone for their support. He continues, expressing surprise at how many owners stepped up to donate. He reassures them that their generosity will go a long way, helping those who are struggling. The crowd discusses their struggles, acknowledging that helping each other might be the only way to make it through. If they stick together, there's a chance. Han Feng remains silent, watching. They think they can outlast this, but he knows better. This disaster is only beginning. At some point, they'll regret giving away their resources. Beside him, Li Ziyi mentions that he's heading out. Han Feng barely reacts, still lost in thought. He nods, acknowledging Li Ziyi's departure, but then something catches his eye. Through the crowd, a girl in a blue winter coat carefully carries a stack of neatly wrapped presents. Her arms are full, her movements cautious, until someone bumps into her. The impact sends her off balance, the presents spilling from her hands as she stumbles. Before she can hit the icy ground, a hand grips her arm, steadying her. Han Feng catches her just in time. She straightens herself, then pauses, recognition flickering in her eyes. She remembers him. Her gaze drifts downward. That's when she notices his leg fully healed. Han Feng's stomach tightens. She's already asking, how did he recover so quickly? He has no answer. His mind races, searching for an explanation. For the first time in a while, he feels exposed. Han Feng keeps his expression neutral, explaining his unusually fast recovery. He mentions that injuries, even serious ones, heal completely in just a few days. His tone is casual, but the weight of his words lingers. The nurse pauses, clearly taken aback. A recovery rate that fast shouldn't be possible. Her gaze lingers on his leg, subtly assessing him for any sign of lingering injury. But there's nothing. His stance is steady, his movements normal. She doesn't question him outright, but the amazement in her eyes is obvious. Shifting the focus away from himself, Han Feng notices the heavy-looking box in the nurse's arms. Without hesitation, he offers to carry it. She shakes her head, declining with a polite smile, explaining that it's heavy. Han Feng waves off her concern, insisting that it's nothing for someone like him. He's strong, after all. Besides, this is a small way to repay her for helping with his injury earlier. The nurse hesitates before eventually handing it over. Since he's so insistent, she won't argue. But she warns him again, it's heavier than it looks. The moment Han Feng lifts the box, his knees nearly buckle. His arms tense as he struggles to keep it up, the sheer weight pulling against him. Holding it is already a battle. Carrying it is an entirely different problem. Fellas, this is exactly why we don't skip leg day. He adjusts his grip, trying to keep himself from looking completely overwhelmed, and asks what's inside. The nurse casually responds, just medical supplies, a donation. Han Feng exhales slowly, keeping his expression neutral. He expected bricks or something more substantial, but apparently this is all muscle power. Noticing his clear struggle, the nurse tilts her head slightly, amused. She asks if it's too much and offers to take it back. Han Feng straightens immediately, brushing off her concern before she can react. He shifts the box slightly, adjusting his grip to make it seem like he has everything under control. He absolutely does not. As they walk, Han Feng keeps the conversation moving. He casually asks if she's always been this strong. The nurse nods, mentioning that compared to most guys, she's stronger. Her tone is casual, stating it as a fact rather than a boast. Then, mid-sentence, she falters. A faint blush appears on her cheeks and her posture stiffens slightly. Han Feng watches her reaction, curiosity settling in. She avoids eye contact, clearly flustered. There's something more to this than she's letting on. Jinshu quickly backtracks, waving off her previous comment as if it never happened. She apologizes, clearly struggling to put her thoughts into words. Something happened, but explaining it isn't easy. She hesitates, glancing at him as if debating how much to say. Mid-thought, she suddenly pauses. A realization dawns on her. She never actually asked for his name. Han Feng, unbothered by the shift in conversation, casually introduces himself. Jinshu responds with a small smile, formally introducing herself in return. There's an ease in her voice as she tells him she's glad to meet him, as if something about this moment reassures her. Han Feng nods, but his expression shifts slightly. The name lingers in his mind longer than it should. His gaze flickers, thoughts momentarily elsewhere. Breaking his train of thought, Jin Shu suddenly asks about his occupation. Without much thought, he answers, he's unemployed. Jin Shu blinks, visibly caught off guard. Han Feng notices her reaction and tilts his head slightly. What's so surprising about that? Before she can respond, a passing figure bumps into her, throwing her balance off. She stumbles sideways, unable to regain her footing fast enough. Before Han Feng can react, she falls straight onto his shoulder. Han Feng immediately tenses. A realization hits him instantly. Her chest is pressed against him. His body locks up, heat creeping up his neck. His heartbeat picks up, though he forces his expression to stay neutral. Jin Shui, still regaining her balance, seems unaware of the effect she's having on him. The moment she stands back up, she quickly apologizes, brushing off the incident as a simple accident. Han Feng exhales and nods, muttering that he's fine, though he avoids meeting her eyes for a moment longer than usual. Before the air can settle, another voice cuts through the moment. Li Huaina steps in, greeting Han Feng with familiarity. Her tone is casual, but there's a pointed curiosity in her expression. She isn't just saying hello, she's questioning why he never mentioned he was going out. Without hesitation, she grabs his arm, subtly pulling him toward her as her gaze shifts toward Jin Shu. Her tone is light, but there's an edge to it as she asks who this is. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, she follows up with a simple question. A friend? Jin Shu shifts uncomfortably, sensing the change in atmosphere. With a quick but polite excuse, she decides to handle the supplies on her own. Han Feng simply nods, accepting without argument. As she walks away, Han Feng turns to Li Huaina, questioning why she's even here. She explains that she came to pick up supplies, but also mentions that no one had heard from him, and she had been concerned. Han Feng casually responds that he was just about to send a message. Li Huaina immediately scoffs, unimpressed. His claim is obviously a lie. She had just seen him chatting away with Jin Shu without a care. Instead of arguing, Li Huaina changes the subject entirely. She bluntly states that she's out of food and needs some. A smirk tugs at Han Feng's lips, clearly entertained by the sudden request. Despite his amusement, he doesn't hesitate to offer her some of his own food, even though his supply is running low. As he does, he casually reminds her that she still hasn't replied to his last message. Then, without much thought, he adds that she can stay at his place for a few days. Li Huaina stiffens slightly, caught off guard by the invitation. Her usual composure falters, a faint, flustered look flickering across her face before she quickly tries to recover. She fumbles for an excuse, explaining that she didn't fully understand the message he had sent earlier. If he really needed to talk, she points out, he could have just reached out to her online. Han Feng simply shrugs and turns to leave. If she's not coming, there's no reason for him to stay any longer. Just as he takes a step forward, Li Huaina suddenly grabs the collar of his jacket, pulling him back slightly. There's hesitation in her actions, but at the same time, an unwillingness to let him leave just yet. Li Huaina watches Han Feng carefully, her tone shifting as she tells him she feels like he's changed recently. She doesn't hesitate as she speaks, insisting that her feelings for him have always been sincere. Her posture stiffens slightly, and she fidgets as she continues. There's hesitation in her voice as she clarifies that she doesn't want people to think she's only with him for his money. She asks for more time, as if needing reassurance that she won't be misunderstood. Han Feng doesn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze darkens as his thoughts shift inward. If this were his first life, maybe he would have believed her. But that was before he died. Before betrayal stripped him of any illusions he once had. His thoughts turned cold. If he hadn't experienced his own death firsthand, maybe he wouldn't be so sure of what was coming. But he has. He knows the truth hiding beneath the surface. He silently vows to tear the mask from her face, no matter how convincingly she wears it. And if the person responsible for his murder is still lurking in the shadows, then all he has to do is wait. The same pattern will repeat. He exhales slowly, regaining control of his thoughts. There is no reason to go searching for his killer when the past is already guiding him. Instead, he makes a decision. He will let Li Huaina lead the attacker straight to him once again. The intensity in his expression vanishes in an instant as he shifts his demeanor back to something casual. With an amused tone, he reveals that he was only teasing her. Li Huaina stares at him, clearly thrown off by the sudden change. Her confusion lingers as she processes his words. Still keeping his tone light, Han Feng tells her he's willing to wait for her message whenever she's ready. He also reassures her that he'll deliver the supplies to her tomorrow. Li Huaina's expression softens slightly, showing a hint of gratitude as she acknowledges his offer. With that, they part ways. Li Huaina casually mentions that if anything comes up, they can talk online. Han Feng nods, sending her off with a brief farewell. As she turns to leave, he casually reminds her to take care of herself and avoid catching the flu. Li Huaina continues walking, but there's a subtle tension in her shoulders. Her pace quickens slightly, her expression shifting to something unreadable. Annoyance, maybe? Or something else entirely. Han Feng watches her go, a smirk playing at his lips. Later that night, back at his apartment, Han Feng sits at his table, enjoying a freshly cooked meal. Steam rises from the food, the warmth providing comfort against the freezing temperatures outside. As he takes another bite, his phone buzzes repeatedly beside him. He glances at the screen. Multiple messages from Li Huina. He doesn't bother opening them. Instead, he leans back, savoring his food. The cold outside is relentless, but inside it's warm, cozy, perfect. Han Feng sat at his table, a warm meal in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. His latest experiments had confirmed something important. Meat couldn't be expanded endlessly, the process had limits. But what mattered more was the second discovery. Meat, like soybeans, could be reproduced without limit. That changed everything. He picked up a piece of steak, turning it between his fingers. The texture was flawless, identical to the original. With a controlled process, he could consume half while using the other half for regeneration. It was the same principle he had already applied to his bean sprout cultivation. Laying out the method in his mind, he visualized the cycle. Half a steak, combined with soybeans, placed under 2 energy lights, yielding a full steak. A perfect balance of resource division. And the process could continue over and over, producing more with each round. The realization settled in his chest like iron. He would never have to worry about food again. He leaned back slightly, eyes lingering on the meal before him. After multiple tests, the results were consistent. This wasn't just a solution. It was survival, secured. The TV played in the background, the familiar monotone of a news reporter filling the room. Han Feng barely glanced up at first, but something in the report caught his attention. The screen showed a snow-covered island, a place that should have been untouched by winter. The reporter stood amid a frozen wasteland, a stark contrast to what the location should have been. The Maldives, a tropical paradise, now buried beneath thick layers of ice. The camera panned, revealing the full devastation. The entire island, blanketed in white. The nearby ocean, once a vibrant blue, was now frozen over, the ice expanding so quickly it could be seen moving with the naked eye. The reporter continued, stating that the ice layer had already grown substantially thick and that similar conditions were now occurring across the equator. The entire planet was shifting into an irreversible deep freeze. Han Feng watched, but his expression remained unreadable. The media always softened the truth. If they were reporting this much destruction, the actual situation was far worse. The world wasn't just changing, it was collapsing. A sudden blast shattered the moment. A deep, concussive force rattled the walls, and the vibrations knocked his drink straight from his hand. Liquid splashed across the table as Han Feng pushed back his chair, his instincts kicking in. His eyes snapped toward the window. Outside, the night was no longer silent. Something had exploded. The sky burned with another explosion. Han Feng's gaze remained steady as he counted in his head. The 7th one. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Something was happening in the city, and it wasn't random. Each blast carried a purpose, but whether it was a warning or an attack, he wasn't sure yet. A low, rhythmic hum rolled through the sky, cutting through the snowfall. He looked up, eyes narrowing as a formation of military helicopters swept across the city, their dark silhouettes stark against the blizzard-filled skyline. Their presence alone confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't just some civilian panic. Reaching for his phone, he scrolled through the latest updates. Chaos had already spread among the owners, their messages flooded with speculation and fear. No one had answers, only frantic reactions. Amidst the confusion, one fact stood out. Bartering had taken over the basement car park. Food, supplies, warmth, everything had become a currency. Those who prepared held the power, and where there was power, there was conflict. Arguments turned into outright fights, with some taking advantage of the growing desperation. A system was forming, but it wasn't one built on trust. Surprisingly, a small group of owners, those struggling the most, had stepped in to distribute free resources. In the group chat, they directed others toward the basement, offering supplies to those in need. Han Feng frowned slightly. This wasn't how it played out before. Something had changed. Descending into the car park, Han Feng's breath clouded in front of him as a brutal chill wrapped around his body. His shoulders tensed involuntarily as the cold bit through his clothes. A sharp sneeze escaped before he could stop it, the sound lost in the hum of gathered voices. He grumbled under his breath. Even with all his preparation, this level of cold still got to him. My man prepared for betrayal, war, even starvation, but not the weather? Come on, bro. As he passed by a cluster of people, a voice floated through the air. Someone casually remarked that they were only here to gather information. Han Feng kept walking, but his ears caught the shift in tone. This wasn't idle conversation. His mind churned as he pieced things together. He had seen this neighborhood fall into rebellion before his rebirth. He remembered who had been involved, remembered the chaos that unfolded. But something was wrong. The ones who had once led the rebellion, the ones who had taken advantage of the weak, were now the ones distributing resources instead. That wasn't how things were supposed to happen. Han Feng's eyes lingered on the long lines forming in the basement. The cold, the desperation. This was the kind of pressure that broke people. If history was repeating, then why did it feel like the script had changed? He exhaled slowly, watching his breath curl into the air. This wasn't just survival. Something bigger was at play. If he wanted answers, he'd have to look deeper. Han Feng stood at the edge of the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the long lines of people waiting in the freezing basement car park. The sheer number of households struggling for basic resources was staggering. This was the breaking point, the moment where survival turned into desperation. The tense air was interrupted by a sharp voice cutting through the chatter. A man from the line argued with the aid distributors, his tone filled with frustration. He wasn't asking for extra resources. He wanted back what he had donated. The distributors, however, remained firm. Everything had already been divided. Each person was receiving an equal share. The man's demands didn't stop. His voice grew louder, insisting that since the supplies had originally been his, he had every right to take them back. But the distributors didn't waver. The resources weren't personal property anymore. They belonged to the survival effort. Jiang Zuyu, standing among the aid workers, calmly handed supplies to someone in line before turning toward the man. His voice was steady as he tried to reason with him, promising that once the crisis passed, compensation would be made. The response was immediate and harsh. The man scoffed, his frustration boiling over as he snapped back that no one knew how long the snowstorm would last. What use was a future promise when survival was uncertain? A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, muttering among themselves. One man near the front seemed particularly irritated, watching the scene unfold with narrowed eyes. It was clear he expected Jiang Shuyu to cave and offer some kind of compensation right now. Before the argument could escalate, a woman nearby stepped in, openly criticizing the complaining man. Her words were sharp. She called out his greed, accusing him of only caring about himself while others had nothing. The man scanned the faces around him. The sentiment was unanimous. Everywhere he looked, he was met with disapproving stares and muttered insults. People weren't on his side. They saw him for what he was, a problem, not a victim. The murmurs grew louder. Some told him to get lost if he didn't like how things were run. Others accused him of intentionally slowing down the process just to make trouble. Han Feng watched the exchange with an almost detached amusement. The man could complain all he wanted, but getting his resources back was impossible. The situation was far beyond personal claims now. Everything had turned into pure survival politics. He shook his head slightly. Shameless. That was the only word for it. As if on cue, a familiar voice chimed in. Li Zi popped up beside him, arms crossed, nodding in agreement. The man's actions were beyond disgraceful. Without missing a beat, Li Zi greeted Han Feng with a casual wave, as if this tense situation was just another regular day. Han Feng raised an eyebrow before acknowledging him. It had been a while since they last crossed paths. With all the chaos in the city, he wondered how Li Zizi had been holding up. Li Zizi shrugged, brushing off the question. Nothing too bad had happened to him, at least not yet. But then, with an unexpected sigh, Li Zizi admitted something else. He was trembling from powerlessness. Han Feng blinked. That wasn't what he expected to hear. He studied Li Zizi for a moment before pointing out, almost dryly, that he was still doing better than most. Li Zizi hesitated before letting out a half-hearted laugh. His real problem wasn't fear, it was hunger. He had been rationing what little he had left, relying mostly on water to suppress the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. Han Feng glanced at him, curiosity flickering in his eyes. He asked, almost offhandedly, if Li Ziyi had any food left at all. Li Ziyi exhaled, shoulders sagging slightly as he explained his situation. Most of his food had been donated to the neighborhood committee, and now his own home was completely out of supplies. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. What was meant to be an act of goodwill had completely backfired. The rations he received in return were far too small, barely enough to sustain him. He regretted donating so much. Han Feng suddenly called his name. Before Li Zi could respond, an arm draped over his shoulder. Han Feng pulled him in close, his expression unreadable as he leaned in slightly. Then, almost casually, he asked for a favor. Li Zi paused, considering it for only a moment before nodding in agreement. A beat later, the mood shifted entirely. Li Ziyi dramatically clasped his hands together, his voice full of exaggerated gratitude as he thanked Han Feng for the food offering. The weight of hunger had clearly made him far too emotional. Han Feng, however, brushed it off. It wasn't a big deal. With a grin, Li Ziyi patted Han Feng's shoulder, promising that he'd handle the small matter with ease. Han Feng simply told him to stop by later to pick up the food. Li Ziyi nodded enthusiastically before turning to leave. He had resources to collect first, but afterward, he'd be stopping by. Han Feng watched him go, raising a hand in a casual thumbs up. As he stood there, Han Feng's mind ticked through the situation. This arrangement had benefits. With Li Ziyi around, he wouldn't need to gather information himself anymore. A brief flicker of guilt crossed his mind. He almost felt bad for Li Ziyi, but in the grand scheme of things, relaxing with food and games was far more valuable than running around collecting scraps of intel. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by a voice calling out to him. Before he could fully react, a hand sliced through the air toward his face. The impact was sharp and immediate. His head jerked slightly to the side, the sting settling in before he fully processed what had just happened. Another thing he didn't prepare for, I guess. A sharp breath escaped him as his gaze snapped back, eyes wide with a mix of shock and pain. Li Huina stood before him, her expression stern and unreadable. There was no hesitation in her posture, no sign of regret. The message was clear. This wasn't just a slap. It was disappointment, frustration, and something else simmering just beneath the surface. The slap landed hard, the sting spreading across Han Feng's cheek. He touched the spot, more surprised than hurt. Li Huina stood in front of him, arms crossed, frustration clear on her face. Annoyance settled in fast. She was acting like he was the problem. He hadn't even settled the last mess she left behind, and now she was throwing accusations at him. She started demanding answers, voice sharp, words firing at him without pause. The way she carried on, it was as if ignoring her messages was some kind of crime. Han Feng exhaled slowly, keeping himself in check. Losing his temper now would just drag this out longer than necessary. He fed her a quick explanation, something that made sense without inviting more questions. As soon as he mentioned the resources were gone, her whole demeanor shifted. The frustration faded, replaced by shock, then disbelief. She pressed for details, asking if he had even looked for them. There wasn't much to say. He had left them outside for a moment to grab his truck keys, and by the time he got back, they were gone. No clue who took them. Her focus changed. Did he have any food left? Not much. If he rationed maybe a few days? It wasn't what she wanted to hear, but it was the truth. But instead of frustration, she lit up. She wasn't relieved because the situation wasn't dire. She was relieved because she had an idea. Without hesitation, she suggested they split everything. The way she said it felt more like a decision than a request, like she had already decided how this was going to play out. Li Huina's tone didn't leave room for discussion. They would split resources. That was the plan. She said it like it was the most natural conclusion, like Han Feng had no say in the matter. There was something unsettling about how quickly she latched onto the idea. Han Feng's expression darkened. She only ever looked for him when she needed something. Now that she was desperate, she suddenly wanted to work together. His patience thinned. He had barely even processed the slap, and now she was acting like this was some kind of equal arrangement. With a slow breath, he forced himself to push down his irritation. There was no point in making this messier than it already was. In the end, he agreed, but on his terms. He wouldn't be handing anything over right now. Later, when he was ready. Li Huina didn't argue. She nodded, acting as if everything was already set in motion. Before leaving, she muttered something about the flu, brushing a hand over her forehead like she was suddenly unwell. Han Feng barely reacted, already shutting the door behind her. Not long after, her impatience took over. She stared at her phone, waiting for a message that never came. Minutes passed, then hours. Each unread message only fueled her frustration. Eventually, she sat on the floor, eyes locked on the screen, the irritation building. When she finally gave up waiting, she made her move. The elevator wasn't working. No surprise, that meant taking the stairs. Step by step, she climbed, cursing Han Feng under her breath. The hunger, the exhaustion, none of this would have been a problem if he had just answered. Every floor she passed only made her more irritated. By the time she neared his place, her legs ached, her breath uneven, but she didn't stop. She was going to get what she came for. Li Huinan gripped the railing, her legs aching with every step. Hunger gnawed at her, but the thought of reaching Han Feng's unit kept her moving. This wasn't about pride anymore, she needed those supplies. Reaching the 16th floor, she barely had time to catch her breath before noticing something strange. The emergency lights were out. That wasn't a good sign. A sudden noise echoed through the stairwell. She tensed, glancing around. Was someone else here? Then, before she could react, something large and dark came plummeting toward her. Panic shot through her as she instinctively raised her arms. The impact never came. Instead, a burst of white powder exploded around her, covering her from head to toe. The emergency lights flickered back on, revealing her completely dusted in flour. Through the haze, Han Feng appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing his head. He muttered an apology, explaining that he had fallen asleep and accidentally knocked over the bag of flour. Li Huina's expression darkened as she wiped the powder from her face. A slap wasn't enough for him. Now he was dumping food on her. She glared at him before calling him exactly what he looked like. A pig. Han Feng, unfazed, handed over a bag. She took it without hesitation, already expecting a decent share of what little he had left. But the moment she opened it, her stomach twisted. moldy leftovers, stale scraps, food that looked barely edible. She turned to him in disbelief. He simply shrugged, explaining that rationing wasn't easy. If she didn't like it, she could hand it back. She didn't. Without a word, she clutched the bag to her chest. Han Feng raised an eyebrow, watching her. He had expected her to throw it back in his face, but she held onto it like it was worth something. As she rummaged through the bag, she pulled out an apple, partially eaten but still salvageable. She turned it in her hands, noting that the inside still looked fine. If she peeled away the bad parts, it could still be food. Han Feng observed her silently. She wasn't as picky as he thought. Or maybe she was just that desperate. Li Huaina clutched the moldy bag of food like it was gold, but she wasn't done. With a quick movement, she snatched the bag of flour straight from Han Feng's hands. He blinked, half amused, half impressed. Was she really taking everything? She turned the bag over, confirming there was still half left. Good enough. Han Feng smirked as she turned to leave, already picturing the stomachache she was about to give herself. But she didn't hesitate, marching down the stairs with her bags, determined not to waste a single scrap. As he watched her disappear, his thoughts drifted. The flour stuck to her clothes, her face, her hair. There was no way she'd be able to shower properly with that mess all over her. He shook his head, not his problem. With a light hum, he turned and made his way out of the stairwell, the cold hallway stretching ahead. He walked at an easy pace, hands in his pockets. The building was quiet, only the occasional creak from the walls breaking the silence. Then, something shifted. A silhouette stood ahead. Han Feng slowed. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there. His senses sharpened, body tensing instinctively. Before he could think twice, another presence appeared, too close. Han Feng reacted without hesitation. His body twisted, pushing the newcomer down before they could make a move. In a single motion, he prepared to strike. Seeking death, a clean takedown was already in motion. But just as his attack was about to land, he froze. The person under him wasn't struggling, wasn't even aware of what was happening. A girl, wide-eyed, completely clueless. Han Feng stared, his brain catching up to the situation. Who the hell was she? Han Feng's grip tightened as he caught the blue-haired girl, holding her firmly in place. She had been following him, that much was clear. The girl lay on the ground, eyes wide, face flushed. No resistance, no attempt to escape, just silence. Han Feng's stare lingered. She wasn't answering. If she was trying to act innocent, it wasn't working. If she was waiting for him to let go, that wasn't happening either. His patience was running thin. He leaned down, his tone turning colder. If she wouldn't answer, he'd find another way to make her talk. The girl's face grew even redder. Still, she said nothing. Han Feng frowned. This wasn't the reaction he expected. With a short sigh, he pulled back slightly, releasing his grip. Fine. If she wasn't a threat, he wouldn't bother. He motioned for her to leave, telling her to go home and stop playing games. He had no interest in wasting more time on this. Just as he turned to leave, a strange feeling crept up his spine. Something felt off. Han Feng's expression darkened slightly as he scanned his surroundings. Before he could react, a hand gripped his wrist. Han Feng turned sharply, his gaze locking onto a purple-haired girl standing before him. She held onto him, not tightly, but deliberately. She didn't speak. Han Feng sighed, growing irritated. If she had nothing to say, he wasn't going to stand here and wait for her. He turned to leave again, but before he could take a step, she lifted her arm and pointed. Han Feng followed her gesture, glancing toward the dimly lit hallway ahead. Was she trying to lead him somewhere? Her expression didn't change, but she gave a single, deliberate nod. She stepped forward and pushed open a door. Han Feng hesitated for only a moment before following. The moment he stepped inside, his eyes widened. Han Feng stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the space. Stacks of supplies lined the walls. Food, water, medical kits, fuel. This wasn't a simple stockpile. This was a survivalist's dream. His gaze shifted toward the girl. Had she gathered all of this herself? Without hesitation, she nodded. That answer alone didn't sit right with him. She hadn't just gathered supplies, she had been ready. His eyes narrowed. She knew this was coming. He asked her directly, did she predict the snowstorm? Once again, she nodded without hesitation. There was no trace of excitement or pride in her expression. She simply muttered something under her breath. Calculations. Ice Age. Han Feng stared. That was it? Before he could press further, she lifted her phone, turning the screen toward him. A group chat filled with messages scrolled in front of him. Detailed weather forecasts, theoretical predictions, timestamps dating back months. His expression tensed. She wasn't just making wild guesses. She had predicted this. Han Feng slowly lowered the phone, studying her carefully. This wasn't about the storm anymore. If she knew this was coming, why bring him here? What did she want? Instead of answering, she raised a finger and pointed. Han Feng followed her gesture, turning toward the far side of the room. A large screen flickered against the wall, rows of monitors displaying multiple live security feeds. One screen showed a stack of boxes being moved through an elevator. The footage was grainy, but it was clear someone was transporting resources. Another screen switched views. This time, it was a group of crew members handling large canisters. Han Feng's stomach tightened. They were delivering them straight to his apartment. His eyes locked onto the last screen. Li Ziyi, standing in the same spot Han Feng had met him before. A realization sank in. This wasn't just surveillance on the storm. She had been watching him. His gaze shifted back to her, his mind racing. How long had she been monitoring him? Why was she tracking his movements? This wasn't some casual coincidence. She had planned this. Before he could demand an answer, she suddenly reached for the hem of her clothes. Han Feng stiffened as she began undressing. His brain stalled for a second. What was she doing? His eyes darted between her face and the movement of her hands. Her expression remained completely neutral. She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. His mind caught up. Wait, was this confirmation? His jaw tightened as he immediately turned away. Without wasting another second, he told her to stop. Whatever explanation she thought she needed to give, this was not it. He gestured sharply toward her clothes, telling her to put them back on. Han Feng's eyes remained locked onto her, his thoughts racing. So, she had been monitoring him. He asked if it was because he was suspected of hoarding resources. The outcast barely reacted. Just a small nod, her eyes still focused on her laptop. His expression hardened, so it wasn't just about hoarding. She had been evaluating him, assessing his actions. His voice remained calm as he pressed further. Was this surveillance meant to determine whether he was useful for cooperation? Again, she nodded. Han Feng exhaled slowly. Fine, cooperation. But what kind of cooperation was she suggesting? Before he could get an answer, she suddenly moved. Without hesitation, she crawled forward, placing herself directly against his lap. Han Feng stiffened, instinctively tensing. His patience was wearing thin. What exactly was she doing? The outcast said nothing. Instead, she pulled out a small generator and set it between them. Han Feng blinked. That was it? She wasn't pulling anything weird. She just wanted to know how to use the device. He let out a breath, shaking off whatever misunderstanding just happened. Focusing on what mattered, Han Feng began explaining the generator's functions. The outcast listened intently, nodding along, her expression serious. She absorbed every word instantly. Once he finished, he glanced at her. Was there anything else she had trouble with? She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she just stared at him. After a brief pause, she raised a hand and pointed. Han Feng followed her gaze, eyes narrowing slightly. What now? A few moments later, he found himself at the water heater, explaining how to adjust the temperature safely. She watched him carefully, then reached out and adjusted it herself without hesitation. Han Feng observed her movements. Fast learner. Lifting a box filled with supplies, he nodded toward her. She needed to know how to properly store raw meat in the fridge. If she wasn't careful, she'd just end up spoiling food. She listened, taking the information in silently. Moving to the stove, Han Feng shifted his focus. Gas safety was critical. He explained how to connect the stove properly, walking her through the steps. As expected, she understood quickly. By now, the kitchen was warming up as Han Feng stood over the stove stirring a wok. He motioned toward the pot of rice, casually explaining how to tell when it was fully cooked. She remained silent, watching closely. Han Feng sighed internally. It was like teaching a child how to survive. The table was set with mapo tofu, twice cooked pork, and a fresh bowl of rice.
Oh, excuse me. Fucking hell.
Han Feng crossed his arms. Even a starving dog wouldn't eat this. If they were trapped in an actual survival scenario, her cooking alone might finish them off faster than the cold. Han Feng had barely taken a few bites when he noticed the outcast slump forward. At first, he thought she was just pausing, but when she didn't move, it became obvious she had fallen asleep mid-meal. He stared for a moment. She had prepared for everything, stocked up supplies, even predicted the storm. But when it came to taking care of herself, she was completely hopeless. Shaking his head, he grabbed a blanket and tossed it over her before stepping away. This wasn't his problem. The next morning, a loud knock pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened the door, the outcast stood there, arms full of supplies. Without saying a word, she shoved them toward him, a ridiculous amount. Han Feng barely had time to react before she was already moving on, asking to be taught about the generator again. He exhaled, so this was his life now. Days passed, and somehow this became routine. Every morning, she knocked on his door with another request: how to store meat, adjust the water heater, cook. It should have been simple. Right now, the stove was on fire, the wok practically glowing. Han Feng pinched the bridge of his nose, stepping in before the flames got worse. The food survived, barely, but looking at it, he wasn't sure that was a good thing. Even a starving animal would hesitate to eat this. If the cold didn't kill them, her cooking might. He sighed, asking for her name. She didn't hesitate, sitting up straight like she had been waiting for this. But instead of a name, she gave him something completely ridiculous. Han Fen didn't react, just moved on immediately. Before he could leave, something outside caught his attention. The hallway was louder than usual, voices rising. Han Fen stepped outside, watching his neighbors argued, clutching at supplies. One accused another of stealing, someone else demanded proof. His eyes narrowed. This wasn't just about supplies anymore. It was fear creeping in. And when fear took hold, things could turn ugly fast. A figure stood in the midst of the chaos, voice raised, demanding resources. His face was contorted with anger, desperation thick in his tone. Tension snapped, a full-blown riot erupted, people pushing, shoving, clawing at whatever they could grab. One man shouted, claiming he got there first. Another snarled back, gripping a crude weapon, making it clear that anyone who dared to take what was his would regret it. An explosion rang out in the distance, shaking the ground beneath them. But no one stopped. Two men grappled violently, fists flying. One slammed the other against a wall, his voice raw with anger, insisting that those supplies belonged to him. The other refused to back down. A pair of brown leather shoes stepped forward, stopping near a splattered dark stain on the frozen pavement. Jiang Suiyu stood still for a moment, looking down at it. Blood. This had gone too far. Without hesitation, he raised a device. A sharp, high-pitched frequency ripped through the air, an intense, blaring sound wave that sent the crowd staggering. People clutched their ears, dropping to their knees. The ones closest to the source collapsed entirely, the sheer force of the noise overwhelming them. Jiang Suyu's voice carried over the stunned silence, cutting through the chaos as he questioned whether they had fought enough. The words echoed, hanging over the weakened, scattered crowd. He let the question settle before stepping forward. In his grip, he held one of the beaten men, a bruised, battered body barely able to stand. It was a clear demonstration of what they were doing to each other. A voice rose from the crowd, angry, desperate. They had the nerve to suggest donating resources, and for what? A single packet of instant noodles? Another man snapped back, arguing that without fighting for resources, they'd starve. Jiang Shuyu exhaled, his expression unreadable. The problem was simple. Resources were running out. The supplies that had been donated, distributed, and shared? Gone. And now only the scraps remained. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was a fight for whatever was left. His expression remained cold as he scanned the crowd, unimpressed by their desperation. The situation was beyond absurd. The situation? They fought over scraps like animals, as if that would change anything. If they were too blind to see who truly controlled their suffering, then maybe they deserved to starve. He let the tension hang in the air before speaking again, forcing them to think. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Someone finally spoke up, hurling blame back at him. The accusation carried weight, and others turned to see how he would respond. Jiang Suyu didn't react. Instead, he held up a single piece of bread, rolling it between his fingers. Then his gaze landed on the speaker, calm, calculated. Without warning, his fingers clenched, crushing the bread effortlessly. The crowd watched as crumbs fell between his fingers. Once, food like this had been cheap, abundant. Then, those in power twisted the rules. Those with control over resources had inflated prices beyond reason, turning necessities into luxuries. The last of the crushed bread tumbled from his hands. One loaf wasn't even eaten whole anymore. It was split into tiny portions, sold to the highest bidder. The system had already chosen its winners and losers. And while most people had bled their wallets dry just to survive, others had seen an opportunity. Some had used the crisis to amass wealth, sitting comfortably while everyone else fought over table scraps. Jiang Shuiyu let his words sink in. The crowd had spent days turning against each other, fighting to claim whatever little remained. But why? The real enemy wasn't among them. The real enemy was still hoarding supplies. He looked directly at the gathering, addressing them with cold precision. Some among them had never lifted a finger to help. They had food, warmth, and security, but chose to keep it locked away. They didn't donate, they didn't share. They just raised prices and let the rest suffer. And yet, it was the desperate and starving who were paying the price. The injustice was clear. Some suffered, while others thrived. Jiang Shuyu forced them to face the truth. The people with full supplies weren't suffering in these riots. They weren't freezing. They weren't starving. So why should the rest continue to break themselves apart while others remained untouchable? The murmurs in the crowd changed. One person finally spoke, realizing the imbalance. Another followed, recognizing that the ones truly benefiting had never lifted a finger. Frustration shifted into something sharper, something focused. The air felt different now. The real fight hadn't even begun. Jiang Xiyu's voice cut through the unrest, shifting the blame entirely onto the hoarders. They weren't just bystanders in this crisis. They were the reason this situation had spiraled out of control. They had taken more than their share. They had let others suffer while sitting on piles of resources. The shift was immediate. The crowd, already simmering with frustration, boiled over. Shouting grew louder, fists clenched. Their anger had found a target. They weren't just desperate anymore, they were ready to take action. Yang Shuyu watched the transformation unfold. His lips curled slightly, just enough for a knowing smirk to form. The chaos, the division, it was working in his favor. They thought they were fighting for survival. In reality, they were moving exactly as he had planned. Li Ziyi stood at the edge of the commotion, phone in hand, watching the situation shift from desperation to something much worse. People weren't just looking for food anymore. They were preparing to take it, by any means necessary. As he scrolled through his messages, he hesitated for a brief moment before typing out a warning. This wasn't just panic. This was the start of something bigger. Han Feng lay sprawled on his couch, a book covering his face. His phone buzzed against his chest again and again. Sighing, he grabbed it and squinted at the screen. A message from Li Ziji. People were turning on each other. Riots had turned into organized looting. Jiang Shuyu had fanned the flames, pushing them into full-blown resource raids. Groups were already moving door to door, breaking in, taking anything they could find. Han Feng scanned the message, then typed back. He wanted to know how soon before they reached his building. His mind ran through the possibilities. Revealing his stockpile was a death sentence. If the mob found out he had resources, they wouldn't stop. They'd tear him apart to get them. He could already imagine it. People forcing their way in, ripping through his supplies, trampling over each other in desperation. There would be no stopping them. His body moved on instinct. Swinging open the stockroom door, he scanned his supplies. Everything was still in place, untouched, safe, for now. He grabbed 2 fire extinguishers, along with whatever tools he could find, anything that could help him buy time. A roll of tape, foil, scissors, and the extinguishers were placed onto the counter. With quick, practiced movements, he wrapped tape tightly around the doorknob, securing a length of cord to it. It wouldn't hold them off forever, but it would slow them down. He gave the taped cord a sharp pull, testing the setup. The mechanism held. It wasn't foolproof, but it was better than nothing. Then, the power cut out. Not just in his room, everywhere. His fingers twitched, reaching instinctively for his weapon. This wasn't part of the plan. Something was happening outside, something bad. The power outage wasn't just in his room. The entire city had gone dark. Han Fen looked out the window. Snow covered the streets, no lights anywhere. People outside were already talking, trying to figure out what happened. The building across from his had gone out too. No signal, no response from management. He sighed. If it was just from overuse, it wasn't getting fixed anytime soon. Without hesitation, he pulled out the generator and a can of fuel. This was expected. He poured the liquid in, checked the wires, and made sure everything was ready. It wasn't panic yet, but it was coming. And once it did, things would only get worse. 30 minutes earlier, Li Huaina sat at a table eating noodles, unbothered. Across from her, a man bragged about how much money he had made. He had bought up resources early, raised prices, and sold them back at a huge profit. People had no choice but to pay. The others at the table stayed quiet. No one argued. The bartender next to her smirked, resting a hand on her cheek. He controlled the resources. He controlled everything. She had made the right choice by sticking with him. But outside, people had started talking. A small group gathered in the hallway, focused, serious. They had picked their first target. A man who had hoarded resources, raised prices, and forced others to struggle while he thrived. Someone motioned toward his door. No hesitation. A kick slammed into the wood. Inside, the bartender flinched, turning toward the sound. Another loud hit, the door shook. Li Huaina kept eating. Then, the final strike. The door crashed open. A group of men stood in the entrance. The bartender froze. It wasn't just a few people. Here's a mob. Outside, people were fighting for resources. Doors were being kicked in. Screams and shouts echoed down the halls. Inside, Han Feng's room was a mess. Boxes stacked up, wires all over the floor. The heater's dim glow was the only thing keeping the cold out. He crouched by the door, looping a cord around the knob. It had to be tight. If things got worse, this door needed to stay shut. Picking up a small device, he flipped it over, expecting it to turn on. But the power was still out. That didn't make sense. A few taps. Nothing. He poked it harder. A sudden spark. A small explosion popped from the knob, sending him stumbling back. Smoke filled the air. He coughed, waving it away. If the internet still worked, this would have been an easy fix. A knock at the door made his head snap up. Moving closer, he peeked through a small hole. A faint light leaked through the crack. That wasn't normal. Then, pale hair came into view. The outcast stood there, waiting. Han Feng already knew what this was about. She needed something. Again, reaching for the doorknob, he hesitated. The outcast always showed up at the worst times, dragging him into her nonsense. He had his own problems, yet here she was, looking for him again. A shadow loomed in his mind, glowing red eyes staring through the darkness. His grip on the doorknob tightened. Then he let go. This wasn't the time to get involved. Through the door, he spoke quietly. The building wasn't safe. A robbery was coming. She needed to go back to her unit. He wasn't opening the door. The outcast didn't move. She stood there, silent for a moment, then took a deep breath. Her fist tapped against the door again. No response. She lowered herself to the floor, arms wrapped around her knees. The cold seeped into her skin, her body trembling as she sat there. A voice echoed down the hall. Someone was speaking, not to her, but close enough to hear. They sounded irritated, whispering about not letting others get ahead of them. Her head snapped toward the hallway. More voices. Someone asked how many people lived on the 18th floor. Another voice answered, it didn't matter. The plan was to break the doors down. A man peeked around the hallway, checking if anyone else had been there before them. It was empty. They chose their targets. 2 units. They'd take them both. One grabbed a crowbar and held out his hand. The other passed him another. They were ready. Knocking with calm voices and a friendly tone, they claimed to be delivering resources. Hanfeng saw through it instantly. It was a weak attempt at deception. Before the outcast could react, he yanked her inside his room. The knocking got violent, fists slamming against the door. Hanfeng told the outcast not to panic, saying they weren't caught yet. She stared at the floor and didn't say anything. Outside, one of the men struggled with a door handle. It wouldn't budge. The other told him to mark the unit and try another. They left. Hanfeng listened until the footsteps faded. Letting out a breath, he then realized his hands were still on the outcast. He quickly stepped back. If these guys kept breaking into places, his door wouldn't last forever. The outcast looked up and gave a small nod. Pressing his ear against the door, Hanfeng listened. It was quiet. Hopefully they were actually gone. He muttered to himself about setting up a trap. If anyone touched his door again, they were getting electrocuted. The outcast tilted her head, staring at the weird-looking contraption in his hands. She asked what it was. Hanfeng explained that it was an electric defense system. The problem was, he had no idea how to install it. He fumbled with the wires, grumbling about how ridiculously complicated it was. Even if he explained it to her, she wouldn't understand. The outcast casually asked if he knew how anti-theft devices worked. Hanfeng blinked. Did she? She nodded. It was easy. She leaned in and started explaining, step by step. Hanfeng listened carefully, adjusting the wires exactly how she told him to. She finished with one final instruction: turn on the power. Flipping the switch, Hanfeng tested the device. It worked perfectly. His gaze shifted to her. How did she know all this? Her response was vague, something that didn't make any real sense. He decided not to ask. Turning back to his work, he asked if she had anything better to do. She didn't answer right away. When he looked up, she was holding a bunch of random objects. She finally responded, but her answer was just as cryptic as before. Hanfeng's head snapped up. That couldn't be right. What did she just say? Shaking his head, he dismissed her entirely and told her to leave. Whatever she was thinking, it was too much. Turning to leave, his foot caught on a cord. Before he could react, he hit the ground. He groaned and pushed himself up, but something felt off. His hands were glowing purple. Oddly enough, there was no pain. His eyes narrowed as he touched the coffee table. It wasn't solid anymore. It felt soft. Glancing at his hands again, he wondered if the purple glow was causing it. Grabbing his toolbox, he confirmed that it had also softened. Then, he picked up a hammer. It bent like rubber in his grip. Shaking the hammer, it wobbled in his hand. Whatever this was, it was changing objects. Then, something felt off. Hanfeng turned his head. His body tensed. The outcast stood there, staring. Her gaze locked onto him, unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, like she knew exactly what was happening. The outcast's eyes locked onto Hanfeng as she focused on him, her expression unreadable. She seemed deep in thought before finally speaking, bringing up something about being an emissary chosen by the evil king. Hanfeng, caught off guard, wasn't entirely sure what she meant. Instead of questioning her further, he nodded, pretending to understand, though in his mind he found the outcast odd. He considered the possibility that she was someone he could manipulate if necessary. Stepping closer, the outcast extended her hand to Hanfeng, suggesting they share an apartment as fellow emissaries. Before he could respond, she abruptly opened the door, then slammed it shut behind her, leaving Hanfeng standing there completely stunned. The sudden invitation to live together caught him off guard. It wasn't every day someone made an offer like that after just meeting. Hanfeng felt the urge to reject her outright, but something about her made him suspect she was simply messing with him. Deciding it wasn't worth engaging further, he left her alone. Back in his own apartment, Han Feng couldn't shake off the image of the purple light he had seen earlier, emanating from the girl. His thoughts drifted to his own abilities, wondering if they had any potential beyond what he already knew. If her power had some kind of special effect, then maybe his did too. The memory of the strange light resurfaced. He recalled the moment he had tripped and nearly fallen, the glow activating around his hands just before he hit the ground. The realization sent a chill through him. His hands had been covered in the same purple light. Intrigued, he began testing its effects on different materials, starting with cables. As soon as he gripped them, he noticed an immediate change. The texture softened, bending under his touch. Wanting to push the experiment further, he grabbed a butcher knife from the kitchen and observed the reaction. As expected, the purple light surrounded the blade, confirming it worked on steel as well. Holding the softened butcher knife, Han Feng noted how strange it felt in his grip, like jelly. The way it flexed made no sense. He wondered if his knife had been practicing yoga with an old martial arts master. He tested the light on more objects, but no matter what he tried, the only effect seemed to be softening. Frustration built up. This ability felt entirely useless for practical purposes. Then, a thought struck him. What if he combined his two lights, the purple and the green? Focusing, he activated both at the same time. Holding the butcher knife, he watched as the purple glow merged with the green, his hands steady. Within moments, the knife hardened back to its original form. Han Feng stared at the blade, stunned. It had returned to normal. His gaze shifted toward a tissue box. Would this combination work differently on other materials? He sat at the table, grabbing a piece of tissue paper, hands trembling slightly from both excitement and anxiety. With the same method, he applied the combined lights and observed a remarkable transformation. The tissue, which was normally fragile, had turned sturdy. Han Feng stared at the tissue, trying to process what he had just discovered. If this worked on simple materials, what else could he reinforce? The implications of this newfound ability started to take shape in his mind. Meanwhile, outside Han Feng's apartment, two men were discussing stolen resources. One asked if the other was handling goods, but the second man refused, saying he had no interest in taking responsibility. Instead, the second man suggested they split the stolen goods among the women and elderly if they willingly handed over their supplies. However, the first man warned against discussing this too openly, knowing they would be in serious trouble if others found out. Before they could finish their conversation, one of the men pointed behind the other, telling him to look. Turning over his shoulder, the man's expression shifted as he noticed something strange. The wall behind them seemed to be wriggling, its surface distorting with random letters appearing. The shape of a face began to emerge from the wall itself, as if the material was molding into something entirely new. One of the men, now masked, reacted with panic as a ghostly figure began materializing from the wall. His companion, holding a flashlight, hesitated, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. His voice wavered as he tried to identify the figure, his fear growing by the second. Muttering amongst themselves, the two men started questioning if they were dealing with something supernatural. The presence of the figure within the wall unnerved them and panic set in. Without hesitation, they bolted, fleeing downstairs in terror. A closer look revealed the truth behind the ghostly illusion. It was Han Feng. His powers had allowed him to create the eerie effect, though even he seemed overwhelmed by the effort. He had constructed a large, slimy barrier along the wall using a mixture of pink and green energy. The strain of maintaining the illusion was evident in his posture. Then, without warning, the wall gave way, the pressure from his power causing it to explode apart. Exhausted, Han Feng barely had the energy to process what had just happened. He muttered about being drained, but knew he had to push forward with more experiments. Lifting a sledgehammer from the floor, he lazily inspected it, considering his next move. With a steady grip, he studied the results of his previous hardening experiment. If his power could make soft things hard, then what would happen if he took it even further? He prepared himself, took a firm stance, and swung the sledgehammer against the newly reinforced wall. The impact was solid. The sledgehammer barely left a mark. Still gripping the handle, Han Feng took a step back, adjusting his stance. This wasn't normal. Whatever he had done to the material had made it incredibly strong. Meanwhile, in the basement parking lot, someone placed a bag of resources on the table. The man apologized for the meager amount of food he had gathered, explaining that most of the suppliers had already run out. His eyes flickered down toward the supplies. It wasn't much, just barely enough to feed those waiting. Then a tap on his shoulder made him turn around. Jin Qinwen, one of the Jin brothers, was standing behind him. Before the man could react, Jin Qinwen restrained him, locking his grip tightly as the struggling man realized he wasn't getting away. Jin Qinwu towered over the man on the ground, his grip tightening as he demanded answers about stolen food. The man, however, had no interest in cooperating. He repeated Jin Qinwu's words mockingly, as if trying to turn the accusation back on him. Unamused, Jin Chinwoo wasn't about to let it slide. The man continued to deny everything, claiming they had already handed over everything they took, but Jin Chinwoo knew what he saw. 3 bags earlier, and now they were conveniently missing. Patience snapped, and he grabbed the man by the collar, calling him a liar. His fist clenched, ready to strike, but before he could land the blow, a firm grip caught the collar of his jacket. Jiang Shuyu had stepped in, calmly requesting that Jin Chinwoo release the man. He assured him there was a better way to handle the situation. Jin Chinwoo hesitated, but after a brief exchange he relented. With an irritated sigh, he threw the man back onto the ground and took a step back. Jiang Shuyu extended a hand, helping the man to his feet. His grip was steady, neither forceful nor weak, as if silently reassuring him that he had nothing to fear. The man didn't respond at first, too wary to trust the sudden kindness. A small, knowing smile spread across Jiang Sheyu's face, and after a long pause, the man finally caved. He revealed several bags of food, his voice low with guilt as he apologized for taking more than his fair share. Jiang Shuyu, instead of scolding him, handed him a portion of his own rations. The man's eyes widened in confusion, hesitating before taking it. Jiang Shuyu reminded him of the rules. Everything collected had to be rationed fairly. But he also understood that desperation led people to make difficult choices. The man bowed his head, accepting the gesture, and thanked him. Jiang Shuyu didn't say much in response, simply reminding him to return the rations quickly. The man introduced himself as Lao Wang, offering to return the favor one day. Jiang Shuyu nodded, taking the supplies from his hands before addressing the rest of the group. He told them to take their rations and return home, and they listened. Some even suggested that he do the same. From a distance, the Jin brothers observed the entire exchange, murmuring among themselves. They found it strange how Jiang Shuyu had convinced Lao Wang to hand over the hidden food so easily, and even stranger that he willingly gave up his own rations. When they pressed him for answers, Jiang Shuyu explained that he had simply helped Lao Wang understand a crucial principle. As the twins continued their questions, Jiang Shuyu elaborated further. He explained the way riots had been defined in Country M, where participants weren't considered criminals unless they were arrested on the spot. The real crime, he noted, was breaking the established rules of the collective. That was what truly separated offenders from the rest. The conversation deepened as Jiang Shuyu pointed out the consequences of Lao Wang's actions. Once the snowstorm passed, Lao Wang would have to face the wrath of those he had stolen from. The Jin brothers started to piece it together. The true consequences didn't come from Jiang Shuyu himself, but from the natural order of things. A group of bystanders had been eavesdropping, their expressions shifting as they processed the information. Among them, a man gripping a pipe seemed to grasp the significance of the lesson. Far from the scene, an older man sat smoking a pipe, his gaze locked onto a monitor displaying surveillance footage. He muttered about how riots always had a leader, and in troubled times, heroes always emerged. His eyes lingered on a particular young man, where the sound of a heavy sledgehammer colliding against reinforced glass rang out. Han Feng, gripping the sledgehammer tightly, trembled from exhaustion. He had been working tirelessly to reinforce his apartment, testing its new durability. His eyes flicked toward the door, thoughts racing. The disturbances outside weren't just random noise anymore. The neighbors were stealing resources. Without hesitation, he bolted toward the door, sledgehammer still in hand. His grip tightened as he called out, demanding to know who was knocking. A familiar voice responded. Li Huina stood outside, calling his name. She claimed she had thought everything through and couldn't betray his feelings. Han Feng stood still, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had heard these exact words before, right before his death. The memory surged back, vivid and unrelenting. His stomach twisted. A large, hooded figure loomed behind her, a baseball bat gripped tightly in his hands. Han Feng's eyes darkened. The same thing was happening again. The exact same setup. His fingers twitched as they reached for his rifle. His mind screamed for revenge, a violent urge surging through him. He could end it, right here, right now. The room was pitch black. The enemy was hidden in the shadows, and he was completely vulnerable. He took a deep breath. Using an electric shock trap was an option, but it had flaws. Getting them both to touch the handle at the same time would be nearly impossible. He needed to focus on the real threat, the hidden man in the dark. Li Huina wasn't the real danger here. A new plan formed in his mind. If he could locate the blind spot where the attacker was hiding, he could strike first. His gaze sharpened. There was only one place the man could be standing. Steadying himself, Han Feng prepared to search for the blind spot, activating his purple light as he scanned the wall. Outside, Li Huina continued knocking, her voice growing impatient. The hooded figure standing beside her shifted slightly, speaking in a low voice. He questioned whether robbing Han Feng was worth the trouble. Li Huina insisted that Han Feng had plenty of resources. She recalled the truck full of supplies he had before the snowstorm. The man gripped the bat tighter, nodding. If Han Feng still had that many resources, they could survive for days. But just behind him, an eerie purple swirl began to form on the wall. Unaware, the bandit took another step forward. The energy behind him expanded, crackling with unseen power. Li Huina turned her head slightly, distracted by something. The bandit beside her frowned, asking if she had heard a noise. She shook her head. Then he sensed it. A sudden, forceful burst of purple energy struck him from behind. He barely had time to react before crumpling to the ground. Dude got turned into an MMA clip. Instant knockout. Li Huina gasped, rushing to the fallen bandit, her hands trembling as she called out to him. There was no answer. Her breathing grew erratic. She took hesitant steps toward the door, reaching for the handle. She barely had time to process what was happening when Han Feng stepped out, fire extinguisher in hand. Li Huina barely had time to scream before the powerful blast struck her square in the face. Peng sprayed Li Huina with the fire extinguisher, his expression hard and unyielding. Li Huina coughed violently, struggling to catch her breath, her body hunched over in discomfort. She pleaded for him to stop, but he ignored her. As the blast finally stopped, Li Huina's gaze fell on her companion, beaten and unconscious on the ground. Her concern turned to desperation as she called out to him, asking for help. Horror filled Li Huina's eyes as she looked at her companion's battered state. Before she could react further, a hand suddenly reached for her. Han Feng's grip was firm as he seized her by the arm. Li Huina instinctively grabbed his hand, trying to break free from his hold. Without warning, Han Feng shoved her away. The force sent Li Huina crashing to the ground, her body tumbling before she could regain her balance. With a shout of desperation, Li Huina ran, calling out for help as she glanced back, seeing Han Feng still watching her retreating form. Han Feng muttered under his breath, mocking her cowardice. He couldn't believe she ran off so quickly. No loyalty, no honor, but at least her cardio is on point. Standing over Li Huina's fallen companion, Han Feng watched as he groaned, slowly trying to get up on his own. Han Feng shouted at the man, demanding to know who gave him permission to rise, before delivering a punishing kick to his gut. The injured man groaned in pain, kneeling in front of Han Feng and begged him to stop, coughing violently in between. Gritting his teeth, the man threatened Han Feng, warning him not to touch him again. He demanded to know who Han Feng's father was, trying to intimidate him. Han Feng didn't hesitate. His fist connected with the man's face, sending him reeling back from the force of the punch. In one swift motion, Han Feng drove his knee into the man's face, emphasizing that he didn't care who his father was. He would continue beating him into submission. The blonde man, now bleeding and disoriented, pleaded with Han Feng to stop the onslaught, his voice strained and weak. Desperate to get through to Han Feng, the man tried to hold him back. He questioned why they were fighting. There was no reason for this violence between them. Furious, Han Feng unleashed another punch, his anger boiling over as he demanded to know why the man was attacking him in the first place. The man, his body now riddled with bruises, struggled to form words, repeatedly asking why Han Feng wanted to kill him. His voice wavered with fear and confusion. Han Feng threatened the man once again, warning him to speak before another punch landed. The blonde man, barely able to move, couldn't respond. His body was too broken to say anything. Meanwhile, Han Feng's eyes darted to the nearby baseball bat, his fingers curling around it as he prepared to use it to escalate the violence. With the bat in hand, Han Feng approached the injured man, his eyes cold and calculating. The man, now crying and bleeding, asked once more for a reason behind the brutal assault, his voice shaking in desperation. Han Feng, fuming, snapped back, demanding to know what reason he had for not beating the man up further. Han Feng warned the man not to play dumb, his grip tightening on the bat as he swung it toward the prone figure. Han Feng stood over the man's broken body, seething with anger. He shouted at the man, demanding to know why he was still trying to survive if he was just going to die by his hand. Suddenly, Han Feng felt an overwhelming sensation in his gut. Before he could process it, he hunched over, vomiting violently onto the ground. Even the toughest guys can't stomach their own rage. Literal gut check. A sudden cough echoed in the room, making Han Feng spin around. He saw the outcast standing in the doorway, her presence unbothered by the chaos around her. The outcast asked Han Feng if he needed any assistance, her voice casual and unaffected by the brutal scene before her. Han Feng eyed the outcast with suspicion. She didn't seem fazed by the bloodshed, which only made him more wary of her. He made a mental note that her stay wouldn't last long. Han Feng warned the outcast to leave, telling her that the attackers might return for revenge, and she could easily find herself caught in the crossfire. The outcast responded calmly, taking a sip of her juice as if she were unaffected by his warning. Han Feng pressed her again, asking if she was leaving or not, emphasizing the danger she was in. Despite his warning, the outcast insisted she would stay, causing Han Feng's frustration to bubble over. Feng repeated his warnings, stressing the possibility of her getting hurt, but the outcast slammed her glass down hard on the table, her determination unshaken. With a nonchalant shrug, the outcast assured Han Feng that the evil King True Eye would protect him, as if the situation were nothing to worry about. She yawned, claiming that the evil king's power had been depleted and that she needed rest. She shuffled off in her slippers, leaving Han Feng standing there in confusion. Han Feng, now irritated, grabbed her arm, admonishing her to stop being so careless and listen to him. The situation was serious and he needed her to understand that. The outcast's expression shifted. Her face became more serious as she met Han Feng's gaze, her eyes locking with his. She simply told him to go on, leaving Han Feng puzzled by her response. As the outcast reached for the door handle, Han Feng's eyes widened in surprise. He wasn't sure what had caught his attention, but something about the scene felt off. Suddenly, an announcement echoed through the basement parking lot, instructing people to clear the area so others could collect their supplies. The reminder about loitering was cold and direct. A crowd had gathered around a small table, everyone waiting eagerly for their supplies to be handed out. Tension was palpable in the air. Li Huina glanced back at the line, sensing the anxiety that seemed to hang over the group, the atmosphere tense and uncertain. Her name was called by the coordinators, and Li Huina stepped forward to collect her supplies, her mind still preoccupied with other thoughts. As she walked away, a voice questioned why apartment 601 was being called again. They had already received supplies earlier, and the confusion spread through the crowd. Li Huina's concern deepened when she realized her companions still hadn't returned. She collapsed onto the ground, her suspicion growing that Han Feng had set a trap for them. Li Huina recalled seeing a flicker of light and feeling a warm breeze from Han Feng's place earlier. She wondered if Han Feng had been preparing for the snowstorm all along, stocking up on supplies in secret. Anger and frustration bubbled within her as she realized Han Feng had been prepared from the start and had kept it hidden, leaving them with nothing but inferior supplies. Determined to find out more, she resolved to investigate Han Feng's place. As Li Huina moved through the crowd, she accidentally bumped into someone. The man immediately called her out on it, his voice sharp. The man's eyes widened with recognition as he spotted Li Huina. She shivered from the cold, unsure of what to make of this encounter. Girl really trading problems like cards. A man gestured toward Li Huina, inviting her to join him and a few others who were warming themselves around a brazier. Li Huina declined, stating that she would warm up at home instead. Before she could leave, the man reached out and grabbed her shoulder, stopping her in her tracks. With an easy smile, he offered her food and a place to stay, his tone carrying an unmistakable hint of something more. The man admitted his preference for girls with a style similar to Li Huina's, making his intentions clearer. Dude really thought that was a smooth line, like it wasn't harassment. Li Huina immediately pushed him away, rejecting his offer outright. She met his gaze and questioned whether anyone even cared about him. Anger flashed across the man's face as he grabbed Li Huina's arm, accusing her of falsely claiming resources. He doubted anyone else could see through her supposed tricks, while she firmly demanded that he let go. The man stepped closer, cornering her. He suggested that she was trying to enjoy the benefits of being part of the committee without actually contributing. Nearby, two onlookers whispered among themselves, their attention fixed on the escalating situation. Seizing the moment, Li Huina wrenched herself free from his grasp and threw the offered food right at him. The man's expression darkened as he glared at her. Without hesitation, he raised his weapon, preparing to swing. Before the weapon could strike, a sudden force interrupted. A new hand came out of nowhere, striking the man hard across the face. In a flash, the newcomer grabbed the man and hurled him over the wall, declaring that bullying women was unacceptable. A group of bystanders noticed something flying past, their senses immediately sharpening as they sensed trouble. As people rushed over to investigate, they saw a figure lying by the wall. One of them called out, searching for Jiang Suiyu. Jin Shu stepped forward, approaching the person who had struck down the attacker. She offered medical assistance. The person waved off her concern, insisting they were fine and declining any help. Jin Shu pulled out a name card, offering it as a gesture of goodwill. The man barely acknowledged the card, simply stating that he was good and thanking her for the offer. Suddenly, a loud insult rang out as someone shoved Jin Shu to the ground, berating her for interfering. Xing spat at her feet. Another man stepped forward, fist clenched, his intent clear. He fully intended to strike Jin Xie, warning her that she wouldn't escape him. Before the blow could land, Li Zi intervened, yanking the attacker backward and slamming him into the ground. The man let out a cry of pain. Nearby, a blond man took a slow drag from his cigarette, his expression unreadable. He stated with clear disgust that men who hit women were the worst kind. At that moment, Jiang Shuyu arrived, moving through the scene swiftly. He addressed the crowd, apologizing for his late arrival as the people acknowledged his presence. One of the previous men wasted no time, immediately accusing Li Huina of falsely claiming resources and associating with a wealthy individual who had raised prices. Li Huina immediately denied the claim. Li Ziyi, seething with rage, grabbed the accuser by the collar. He pointed out the hypocrisy of a man who assaulted women now trying to complain about injustice. Just as his temper flared, another hand suddenly reached out, halting him mid-action. Jiang Shiyu took control of the situation, reminding the man of the committee's duty to protect the weak and ensure fairness. He then expressed regret over the incident. With a sharp warning, Jiang Shiyu made it clear that if this happened again, the offender would be expelled. He then turned and walked away, leaving the crowd to absorb his words. Jiang Shiyu then shifted his attention toward Li Ziyi and Jin Shi, acknowledging that they must have been startled by what they had witnessed. Then he took the opportunity to make another appeal, urging them to reconsider his previous offer. Li Ziyi didn't hesitate in his response. He outright rejected the offer, making it clear that he had no interest in taking from others. Even if it meant starvation, he would not be part of Jiang Suiyu's cause. With that, he walked away. Jin Shi, however, took a more measured approach. Though she declined his proposal, she offered an alternative way to help. Jiang Suiyu acknowledged her counteroffer and accepted it with gratitude. Meanwhile, Lei Hyun stepped forward, expressing a desire to join Jiang Shiyu's group. Li Hyuna, watching the interaction, admitted that she had always admired Jiang Shiyu, even if she had acted differently before. Jiang Shiyu turned toward Li Hyuna, questioning whether she was confused about something. With a slight push, he dismissed her, telling her to figure out her own path. He apologized, explaining that she had yet to offer anything of real value that would convince him. Li Huina's expression shifted. She told Jiang Shiyu that she knew of a place with resources. That revelation made him pause. In a separate setting, Han Feng was focused on something else entirely. He emphasized his request for a particular item, a fan made of leaves. The outcast reached into a shimmering blue portal, pulling an object from within. Han Feng's excitement was immediate. His enthusiasm vanished as soon as he saw what she was holding, a mannequin. His disappointment was clear. Han Feng sighed, realizing the complexity of the situation. He acknowledged the outcast's ability, revealing that she possessed dimensional storage powers. He further explained that while she could create portals to store items, retrieving specific things was another matter entirely. Someone had even complained that his house kept filling up with misplaced objects. Han Feng bombarded the outcast with questions about the portal, how difficult it was to find things, whether it was a virtual space or if the items were being sent elsewhere. The outcast admitted that the space was vast and largely unexplored. Han Feng offered to stick his head inside to help her search, to which the outcast agreed. Since she could easily move her hands inside, he reasoned, his head shouldn't be an issue. Han Feng leaned forward, pushing his head into the portal. The outcast watched curiously as he disappeared into the hole. Inside the portal, Han Feng opened his eyes, taking in the vast space before him. Surprise overtook him as he took in the sheer size of the dimension. Floating objects surrounded him, countless misplaced items. Han Feng was awed by the scale of it all. He realized that the outcast must have emptied entire supermarkets into this space, making his search feel impossible. Panic struck as he suddenly felt the lack of oxygen. Ah yes, who could have guessed that alternate realities don't have oxygen? What a buffoon! Desperate, Han Feng yanked himself free. Gasping as he returned to reality, he coughed violently, struggling to recover. Between breaths, he complained about the complete absence of oxygen inside. The outcast admitted that she hadn't realized the issue since she had never entered herself. Her attention was drawn to something. Reaching in, she pulled out an unknown object, declaring that she had found the item. Han Feng's frustration melted into excitement. The outcast casually mentioned that she had also found several other things, catching Han Feng off guard. He stood among a growing pile of scattered boxes, stunned by just how much had been retrieved. Dude could have just went to Costco or something. The group ascended the dark, crumbling stairwell, the beam of their flashlight flickering against the worn number 18 on the wall. A sense of unease lingered in the air, one of the men questioning the significance of the number as a sense of foreboding grew. As they continued their ascent, a low murmur rose. One man voiced his concern about the potential for another encounter with a monster, while another dismissed the notion of supernatural forces, trying to shake off the creeping tension. A third man chimed in, his tone scolding, telling them they were being overly cautious, still clinging to their fear of the supernatural. He reassured the group, reminding them of Jiang Shu's trust in them for this mission. They could not afford to falter. The group pushed on, the beam of their flashlight cutting through the dark. One of them hesitated, quietly wondering aloud about Li Huina's true intentions. In a separate room, the outcast held a controller, her eyes fixed on the dimly lit hallway on the screen. She watched as potential burglars moved while the leader spoke, assuring everyone that Jiang Suyu's judgment was sound and their return would be swift. Han Feng and the outcast observed the feed, the screen showing the burglars' return. Han Feng breathed a sigh of relief, grateful for the surveillance setup that had given them the upper hand. Han Feng turned to the outcast, his voice low as he instructed her to activate Plan 2. With a promise to return before the next stage began, the outcast nodded in understanding. Han Feng glanced at the stopwatch, his focus sharp. He emphasized the importance of precise timing for what was about to unfold. The stopwatch ticked down, now reading 2. Time was quickly running out. Back in the dark stairwell, the burglars froze. A noise had caught their attention, and one of them muttered, half in disbelief, wondering if it was a ghost. Suddenly, glowing orbs began to drift down the stairwell, their soft light contrasting with the oppressive darkness. This gotta be the world's worst light show! Toy cars descended from above, spinning through the air and clattering to the stairs below, their strange appearance unremarked by the burglars. The burglars watched the toys fall, their faces unmoved. The unusual sight barely registered in their minds. One of the toy cars collided directly with the leader, and to their shock, the toy revealed a hidden explosive. "Who's making these toys, Jinx?" The explosion detonated and the stairwell filled with smoke, engulfing the area in chaos. The smoke thickened, disorienting the burglars. One yelled out, desperately trying to locate his comrades, while another, blinded by the lime-colored smoke, cried out in confusion. A drone, equipped with an explosive, flew into view, its tail trailing a menacing glint. The burglars reacted in panic, their nerves beginning to unravel. One of the burglars screamed in alarm, urging his companions to flee, but in a desperate act, he threw the drone off to save himself. A second drone appeared, hovering behind another burglar. The outcast, watching intently, asked what "throw" meant. Han Feng responded sharply, instructing her to act when the drone was close and teaching the burglars a lesson in the process. The digital display continued to show the scene as a figure attacked the drone, furiously cursing at the device. Han Feng warned the outcast not to let the drone be destroyed. On the screen, the figure's frustration grew as they continued to strike at the drone. Han Feng's voice cut through the air, urging the outcast to protect the device at all costs. A burglar, wielding a large bladed weapon, swung violently at the drone, his strikes landing with precision. The outcast tracked the impact, noting the damage, while the countdown reached 5 seconds. Han Feng called to the outcast, his voice urgent. He ordered her to regain control of the drone. It was their only one. The timer now read 3 seconds before it was thrown away. Frustration tinged Han Feng's voice as he shouted at the outcast to keep control. She stammered, unable to reply as the timer ticked down to just 1 second left. A burst of light erupted as the timer reached 0, and a firework-like display ignited in the air. The drone faltered, its malfunction causing it to plummet. The outcast watched the descent, her voice steady as she told Han Feng to find a safe landing spot for it, hoping it would land intact. Han was sent to... The drone crashed outside a window, its journey coming to a rough halt as it landed on a certain floor. Han Feng discussed retrieving the drone, his voice filled with determination. The outcast provided its location, casually mentioning that a corpse lay between the stairs. Han Feng questioned the outcast, his eyes narrowing as he processed the claim about the corpse. He watched the feed intently. The surveillance feed sharpened, revealing a blonde man lying motionless on the staircase. Han Feng instructed the outcast to zoom in on the figure. The zoomed-in image revealed the man more clearly. Han Feng's expression shifted as he recognized the face. His brother Li Ziyi. Han Feng watched Li Ziyi lying there, confusion and concern overtaking him. Why was he here? A mix of worry and suspicion flooded Han Feng's thoughts. Could Li Ziyi have been robbed? Han Feng opened the drawer, his hands moving quickly as he spoke to the outcast, instructing her to stay put and not open the door for anyone while he stepped out. Han Feng was absorbed in his task, but his eyes flickered towards the outcast, sensing her presence before returning to his work. The outcast held a device, and Han Feng, now distracted, questioned its purpose. She calmly explained it was a communication device, and he accepted the walkie-talkie with a quiet thanks. Han Feng retrieved a gun from the drawer, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He hoped he wouldn't have to use it, but he was ready if the situation demanded. Han Feng descended cautiously into the dark stairwell, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence, his flashlight illuminating the path ahead. He passed the 17th, 16th, and 15th floors, each marked as safe by the outcast, his resolve unwavering as he moved down into the unknown. Reaching the bottom, Han Feng pulled out a thermometer. The outside temperature read a frigid 49.8 DC. He noted the deadly cold. Unprotected humans would freeze within 30 minutes. A sense of urgency gripped Han Feng as he muttered to himself. He needed to reach Li Ziyi, and fast. "Well, chop chop then, little bro!" A man's voice called out, warning against stepping outside in such extreme conditions. The dangers were clear. Meanwhile, Jiang Shuiyu worked in the basement car park, attending to the steady stream of people seeking resources, his focus unbroken. He ordered the coordinator to hand out 3 sets of thick clothes to 3 individuals. The recipients expressed their gratitude, thanking Jiang Suiyu for his generosity. Jiang Suiyu watched as the clothes were passed out, a small smile crossing his face as the trio expressed their thanks again. He reassured them that he would never treat people unfairly. Li Huaina's request was met with resistance. Jiang Suiyu refused, citing a lack of confirmation regarding her friend's involvement, along with Uncle Liu's observations of resource movement that cast doubt on her intentions. Jiang Suiyu turned to one of the Jin brothers, suggesting they check the floor of interest. The individual agreed, while another was tasked with bringing a toll to Li Huaina. Jiang Suyu's tone shifted slightly as he expressed hope that Li Huaina could prove her worth in the upcoming operation. Whether her information was accurate or not, her role remained vital. Li Huaina grabbed a pipe from one of the twins, her compliance clear as she readied herself for the mission ahead. Jiang Shuyu addressed the group, his voice firm as he advised them to prioritize their safety while going up. The risk of failure loomed large. The group began moving up the staircase, the tension palpable as they prepared for what lay ahead. Heading up a dark staircase? Horror movie protagonists aren't this dumb. One of the Jin brothers stopped, noticing something in the distance. He called Jiang Suyu's name urgently. A body lay in the stairwell. Li Zi, lifeless at first glance. However, he was still alive. Li Zi, in a terrible condition, drank a warm liquid from a container. The warmth of the liquid caused Li Zizi to react sharply, his face contorting as he yelled, the heat unbearable. Li Ziyi's eyes widened as he noticed Jiang Shu and the others arriving. He continued to recoil from the heat, struggling to regain composure. He muttered under his breath, his frustration clear as he complained about his bad luck surrounded by cold and chaos. One of the Jin brothers stepped forward, confronting Li Ziyi about his ungrateful attitude towards Jiang Shuyu, who was only trying to help by offering the warm water. Li Ziyi scoffed at the gesture, his anger rising. He retorted bitterly, stating that if anyone deserved thanks, it was the people from whom the resources were stolen. Jiang Shuyu stepped in, positioning himself between Li Ziyi and the Jin brother, his gaze steady as he tried to defuse the situation. Li Ziyi's voice cut through the tension, rejecting Jiang Shuyu's repeated offers, his frustration boiling over. The Jin brother's temper flared as he accused Li Zi of being shameless and refused to budge, demanding an answer. Join the group or move out of the way. Li Zi, unfazed, challenged them, questioning if they were attempting to force him to join their ranks. His defiance was clear. Jiang Shuyu grabbed Li Zi's shoulder, his voice calm but firm. He asked if there was some misunderstanding, stating they wanted to help him grow stronger so that those who were weak had a better chance at survival. Li Zi's anger flared again, his words bitter as he accused Jiang Shuyu's group of only offering older people one meal every 3 days, a sentence that was essentially a death sentence. With finality, Li Ziyi declared that their methods wouldn't work on him. He had no parents to care for, and he was already resigned to his fate. Han Feng watched the exchange with a heavy heart. His mind worked as he realized the harsh truth. Jiang Shuyu didn't care for the older members of the group. Han Feng took in the tirade, his mind calculating. He understood the committee's strategy of recruiting vulnerable individuals, but he foresaw the inevitable conflicts that would arise. One of the Jin brothers approached Li Ziyi, his voice rising in anger as he accused the young man of refusing their help. He demanded an answer. Did Li Ziyi want to join or not? And if not, he was to move aside. Li Ziyi, his temper flaring, suddenly headbutted the Jin twin, refusing to budge, his defiance clear in his challenge. A grunt escaped Li Ziyi as pain shot through him. He felt a sharp blow from Jiang Shuyu, whose attempt to strike him was swift but ineffective. Jiang Shuyu watched with a calculating gaze, his group caught off guard as he whispered something to them, preparing for what was to come. A group of armed men appeared, surrounding Li Ziyi. He stood his ground, his voice unwavering as he declared that the cold did not frighten him. Han Feng watched from above, his concern growing as he saw Li Ziyi's precarious position. His instincts screamed at him to intervene, to protect the man who once helped him. Nah, dude is probably just aura farming. Han Feng's thoughts raced. He was outnumbered and his options were limited. Direct intervention was impossible. He needed to act carefully, but time was running out. A moment of resolve washed over him. His face tightened with determination as he made his decision. Reaching for his pistol, he prepared to step into the fray. There was no turning back now. His fingers wrapped tightly around the grip, his breath steady as he weighed his next move. He gripped the handgun firmly, his gaze sharp and focused. The time for hesitation had passed. No more watching from the shadows. Meanwhile, Li Ziyi gestured toward the armed men, his expression unreadable. He challenged them, his stance ready for whatever may come. He wasn't backing down. Either intoxicated by his own anger or deliberately provoking them, Li Ziyi stood firm. His face revealed nothing, as if daring them to make the next move. Han Feng's shot shattered the tense silence, the gunshot echoing through the darkened space. The sudden bang sent a baseball bat clattering to the ground, the group recoiling in alarm. The bullet hole on the floor was proof that Han Feng wasn't bluffing. Fear spread like wildfire. The reality of their situation hit them all at once. Han Feng, calm but cold, kept his pistol trained on them, his voice sharp as he commanded them to stay put. Li Zi's eyes widened as he recognized Han Feng. The shock deepened when he saw the gun in his hands, something he never expected from him. It was clear he was struggling to process the sight. From a distance, Jiang Shui watched with keen interest, his eyes flicking over every detail. Meanwhile, Li Huaina's mind raced. Why was Han Feng out of his house? And more importantly, why was he armed? Han Feng stepped closer to Li Ziji, handing him a key with a firm order. It was time to retreat. They couldn't stay here. The group hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The looming threat of the gunmen held them frozen, but some wavered, considering whether they could take advantage of the moment. Another gunshot rang out, another hole in the ground. Whatever hesitation was left vanished. Han Feng's voice sharpened again, commanding them to drop their weapons and kneel. Fear won out. No one dared to move as Han Feng and Li Zi began their retreat. He gave one final warning. Any movement, and he'd shoot. The group stood frozen, trying to steady their nerves as Han Feng disappeared into the shadows with Li Zi. As they descended into the snow-covered stairwell, the cold seeped into their bones. The weight of the encounter sat heavily on their shoulders. Jiang Shuyu finally broke the silence, explaining the identity of their unexpected gunman. Li Huina was quick to confirm it was Han Feng, and he was their target all along. One of the Jin brothers grabbed Li Huina by the jacket, frustration boiling over. Why hadn't she told them Han Feng was armed? She defended herself, claiming this was the first time she had seen him with a gun. Chang Xiaoyu intervened, instructing the Jin twin to let go. He reassured them that Li Huina wasn't lying, though disbelief lingered in the twins' eyes. Chang Xiaoyu's mind worked quickly. If Han Feng had a gun, it likely meant he had a stockpile of supplies. That was the only explanation. The group considered the possibility. Could Han Feng be the one controlling resources, maybe even inflating prices? Jiang Xiyu connected the dots. If Han Feng was behind the rising stock prices, then he had to be the one Uncle Liu had seen. One of the Jin twins raised a concern. Should they still go forward with their plan? What if Han Feng actually shot them? Jiang Suyu dismissed the concern. If Han Feng was going to kill them, he would have done it already, and besides, no one could stay hidden forever. He turned to the group and announced a change in plans. They would return later, once they had the right safety measures in place. But when the time came, they would take down Unit 1800. Han Feng's home. Inside Unit 1804, Han Feng and Li Ziyi stood just outside the door. Li Ziyi grumbled, his hand trembling from the cold as he struggled to unlock it. Han Feng remained alert, pistol still in hand. He reassured him, no one was chasing them. Li Ziyi slid the key into the lock, exhaling as warmth rushed out from inside. The contrast between the frigid outside and the heat within felt unreal. Han Feng urged him inside, gun still drawn. He wasn't taking any chances. Once inside, Li Ziyi froze, his eyes landing on the radiator. The warmth, the comfort, it felt like a different world compared to the nightmare outside. His gaze wandered further, locking onto a generator in a fully stocked storage room. This wasn't just a lucky break, this was a jackpot. Li Zi turned to Han Feng, still in shock, and demanded an explanation. Han Feng offered a small, amused smile. It was a long story. The outcast peeked through the door, interrupting them with a question about the drone. Li Zi, still processing the situation, vaguely gestured toward the stockroom. Han Feng muttered to himself, realizing he had completely forgotten about their original objective. Li Ziyi pressed again, asking about the drone. 2 hours later, as they ate, Li Ziyi reflected on everything. The snowstorm, the hidden stockpiles, Han Feng's secret preparations. It was a lot to take in. He absent-mindedly muttered that maybe studying hard really was worth something after all. The outcast and Han Feng exchanged a glance, but said nothing. Han Feng eventually broke the silence, apologizing to Li Zi. He admitted he had lied about his supply situation. He had to keep it a secret, otherwise news of his stockpile would have spread. Li Zi set down his chopsticks, staring at Han Feng. Then, with complete sincerity, he thanked him. Without Han Feng's help, he would have starved. Han Feng called his name, watching as Li Ziyi struggled to hold back emotion. Li Ziyi thanked him again, his voice thick with gratitude. Han Feng patted his shoulder in reassurance, but the young man kept repeating his thanks, unable to stop himself. The outcast watched, silent as always. After regaining composure, Li Zi spoke again. Things had changed in the complex. The situation was getting worse. He then asked Han Feng if he remembered the last message he had sent before the blackout. Han Feng tried to recall, his expression tightening as he focused. He finally answered, Jiang Suyu had been moving around, hoarding supplies while pretending to distribute them for the collective good. His followers played along, but some, like Li Ziyi, had distanced themselves. Li Ziyi nodded. Jiang Suyu didn't care about those who left his group, but there was more. Jiang Shuyu sent Jin Qinwu to handle anyone who defected. Han Feng stiffened at the revelation. One of the Jin twins was working as Jiang Shuyu's enforcer? Li Ziyi smirked, muttering an insult about the twins, calling them book-mart fools. Han Feng shook his head, muttering about how underhanded the committee had become. He wondered how Jiangshu had turned into such a difficult problem when he initially seemed easy to deal with. Li Ziyi mused about karma, then turned to Han Feng and asked a simple question. Did he know who the committee had tried to rob? The truth hit like a brick. The target was Li Zhenghao, a former middleweight champion boxer, and now the pieces were falling into place. Yi and Han Feng continued their discussion, the weight of the conversation heavy in the air. Han Feng, eyes narrowed, questioned whether the committee members had suffered badly. Li Ziyi nodded, confirming it, but added that Jiang Shuyu refused to admit defeat. His voice took on a more serious tone as he mentioned how Jiang Shuyu had been encouraging the crowd to continue the fight against Li Zhenhao despite their losses. With a resigned sigh, Li Ziyi explained how everyone had been pummeled by Li Zhenghao's overwhelming force, leaving them no room to retaliate. After the confrontation, Li Zhenghao had gained a following. Among them were two particularly notable individuals, their presence a sign of the power shift. One of the followers, Zheng Yangyu, was a blur of speed, known for his participation in underground boxing and his devotion to Li Zhenghao. Li Ziyi recalled seeing him pulling two individuals who might have been casualties of the chaos. Then there was Jin Zhangzhai. His strength was legendary. Li Ziyi described him as a monster, capable of crushing two people with ease. His loyalty to Li Zhenghao was unshakable as he stood, gripping two individuals with terrifying force. With these figures by his side, Li Zhenhao had formed a faction of his own. Their new target was Jiang Shuyu's group, which Li Ziyi couldn't help but label as hypocritical. Han Feng's thoughts wandered as Li Ziyi explained how Jiang Shuyu might try to resolve the situation without escalating violence, instead turning his focus toward Han Feng's residence. Han Feng considered the possibility that Jiang Shuyu might just be using Li Ziyi as a pawn in his scheme. Li Ziyi admitted that he should have warned Han Feng earlier about the intentions to raid his unit before everything went dark. Han Feng's mind was racing. Was Jiang Shuyu's group struggling? Li Ziyi's rejection might have weakened them, but could that be enough to turn the tide? Suddenly, a sharp knock on the door broke through Han Feng's thoughts. Li Ziyi's gaze shot toward the sound, a quiet tension building. The outcast spoke up, her voice revealing the truth. Someone was at the door. Jiang Suye's group had arrived. Han Feng reacted immediately, preparing to electrify the door. Li Ziyi's shock was evident, but before Han Feng could act, the outcast grabbed him by the collar, a warning on her lips. She could smell sulfur in the air. Suddenly, the room fell into chaos. Han Feng remained standing, unaffected by the sudden collapse of the others around him, who had succumbed to the effects of the explosion. He winced, clutching his head. The sulfur... Jiang Shu's choice of tactic became clear, and the pain only made his resolve stronger. The outcast turned to Han Feng, her expression calculating. The explosives were localized, small in scale. Li Ziyi's realization mirrored the growing unease within the group. Jiang Shuyu's men were playing a different game. Han Feng's eyes locked onto the feed. He recognized the signs, the familiar figures flashing on the screen. This wasn't just coincidence. The feed zoomed in, revealing Jiang Shu and Li Huaina in quiet conversation. Han Feng's suspicions flared. Li Huaina had been the one to bring this chaos to his doorstep. His voice cut through the tension, ordering Li Ziyi to move back from the door. Li Ziyi obeyed, the urgency in Han Feng's actions clear. Han Feng connected a cord, his fingers brushing it in preparation for what was to come. The sound of electricity surged through the room, a sharp crackle. A man outside screamed in agony as the electrified door did its work. Bro got shock therapy for free, lucky guy. The group outside rushed to the electrocuted figure, panic spreading like wildfire. Jiang Shuyu stood near, observing the scene with a chilling calm, noting that the door was indeed electrified. Jiang Shuyu's orders were precise, his tone cold. Jin Qinwu was instructed to place additional explosives, increasing the stakes with 2 packets this time. Jin Qinwu accepted the task without hesitation, fully aware of what needed to be done. The explosion hit again, a force that shook the room. The door frame trembled, but it held. A report came in, but it wasn't good news. The door had not been destroyed. Jiang Shuyu's eyes narrowed as he studied the door, his mind racing. The failure wasn't on their end. The explosives were flawless, No, their target had prepared for this. Jiang Shiyu's frustration turned to determination. He ordered the use of 3 packets this time, taking charge of the placement. Today, the door would be destroyed. Han Feng and Li Ziyi struggled to keep a pile of furniture in place, a barrier between them and the growing force from outside. Suddenly, the furniture shifted violently, knocking both men to the ground. They scrambled, struggling to regain their footing. As they recovered, the deafening noise of explosions filled the room. Han Feng shouted over the noise, asking if Li Zi could hear the growing intensity of the explosions. Li Zi, unable to hear clearly, shouted back, asking Han Feng to repeat himself. A cracking noise cut through the chaos. Han Feng's gaze snapped to the source. The wall. The cracks were spreading. Li Zi shouted to add more furniture, but Han Feng was already thinking ahead. He could feel the wall's integrity failing. His heart raced as he fought to keep the furniture in place, his mind calculating the weakening structure. Every second mattered, and the cracks were growing. Li Zi struggled with the weight of the furniture, but Han Feng's words cut through the tension. The barrier wasn't going to hold. He needed to move everything, fast. Unexpectedly, the outcast volunteered herself, moving toward the door with determination. Her unexpected willingness caught both Han Feng and Li Zi off guard. Li Zi watched in disbelief as the outcast cleared the furniture. He hesitated for a moment but then turned to her, urging her to go back to safety. But the outcast was already pulling out a portal, her focus unwavering. The portal expanded rapidly, a swirling sphere of energy that grew larger before their eyes. What is this, an over-glorified Roomba? Li Ziji's jaw dropped in shock, unable to comprehend how such a young child could wield such power. In an instant, the portal exploded outward, sucking the furniture into its vast interior. The room was cleared in moments. The outcast stood, her expression satisfied. Cleanup was finished. Li Ziyi was still frozen, his surprise evident. Han Feng's energy surged as purple light radiated from his hands, and Li Ziyi watched in awe. There was more to this man than anyone had realized. Han Feng's focus was intense as his glowing hands touched the damaged wall. He was carefully managing the area of effect, the magic requiring delicate control to reshape the structure. Dual-colored magic, green and purple, surged through Han Feng's hands as he worked on the damaged wall and door, his concentration unwavering. The reshaping process was complete. Han Feng stepped back, his gaze meeting Li Ziyi's. It was a magic unlike anything Li Ziyi had ever seen, leaving him in awe. Han Feng, however, shrugged it off, calling it hard to explain. The outcast's warning came just in time. Danger was approaching. She yelled for them to take cover. The group dove for cover as another explosion shook the room, the force nearly knocking them off their feet. Han Feng's eyes widened. The wall, despite their efforts, was cracking again. The outcast's voice remained calm, explaining that the bomb was now being planted on the floor. Pang Fin's mind raced. If they kept bombing the place, there would be no point in repairing anything. He hesitated for a moment, then made a dangerous decision. He needed their trust if this plan was going to work. The outcast gave a brief hum of agreement, her eyes focused on Han Feng's every move. Li Zi wasn't sure what was coming next, but his face showed he was ready for anything. Han Feng had their full attention. With a steady voice, Han Feng gave his command. Everyone was to follow his lead. There was no turning back now. A door was forcefully kicked open by the determined group in search of supplies, their urgency evident in every step. Inside a dim building, the group scattered into different rooms. Under the steady direction of Jiang Shuiyu, they began searching methodically for any useful resources. Jiang Suyu's commands were clear. Find supplies and stay alert for potential ambushes. He directed them toward the kitchen if the living room proved barren. The searchers returned with their findings. The living room yielded nothing, their report confirming a complete lack of supplies there. From the kitchen came a different result, a box filled with seeds, a resource of considerable value. Jiang Suyu's eyes narrowed as he questioned the limited nature of the discovery. Jun Chenwu looked toward Li Huina, suspicion mingling with frustration as he wondered if they had been misled about the building's contents. Li Huina countered, suggesting that perhaps the remaining seeds were concealed within the bedroom. Two men approached a doorway with caution. One's every step was deliberate, while the other signaled the need for care as they neared an uncertain threshold. The man attempting to open the door found himself taken aback by its unexpected unlocked state, a moment of surprise halting his progress. Before any further action could be taken, a sudden foot struck the man from behind, its force amplified by the protection of a riot shield. In moments, both he and his assailant lay on the ground. Han Feng stepped into view, his pistol now trained on the subdued group. A man wielding a riot shield offered a warning regarding Han Feng's armed presence, his tone carrying an edge of caution. With practiced precision, Han Feng fired a bullet. The projectile found its mark on one of the shields, its impact a stark reminder of the danger present. Han Feng's threat hung in the air, a silent command for Jiang Shui's group to retreat. a promise of escalating force should they remain. Jiang Shu's response was measured yet cutting, a reminder of past actions that left others suffering from a hoard of supplies, his accusation laced with a cold sense of betrayal. Her heart ached. A demand for justice rose from Jiang Zihu, his tone one of resolute authority over the unfolding scene. He further instructed Han Feng to relinquish the supplies, appealing to a shared survival ethic, a vision of unity in the face of the apocalypse that contrasted sharply with individual greed. Han Feng's mind responded with a dismissive evaluation. The righteousness of those words only fueled his belief that Jiang Ziyu's actions amounted to moral coercion. In a moment of clarity, Jiang Shuyu recognized the desperation that festered within his own group, a vulnerability ripe for manipulation. Han Feng stood firm, denying that he possessed any supplies. His stance was unyielding, his tone one of cold denial. From a distance, Li Huainu accused him of deceit, her gaze fixed on signs of activity emanating from his house. The implication was dire. The truth must be revealed before it was too late. In a split second, a bullet nearly found its mark on Li Huina. She dodged in time, the protective barrier of a shield just sufficient to deflect the attack. Dodged a bullet, literally. Can't say the same for her reputation, though. Accusations mounted as Li Huina was blamed for a scam, a treacherous exchange that traded much-needed supplies for what turned out to be useless seeds, leaving the group in a state of desperate disarray. Jin Xianwu's anger boiled over as he confronted Li Huina, suggesting that her actions were nothing but a cruel manipulation. Li Huina, however, rejected the charge, her defense laced with equal parts defiance and distress. In response, Jiang Shu stepped forward, proposing a straightforward resolution to end the conflict, a solution that he believed would restore order. His plan was simple: send a pair of his men to thoroughly search Han Feng's room. The order was delivered with unwavering confidence, directed at Han Feng for his implicit approval. A thorough search, the two operatives reported back with disappointing news. Han Feng's room contained nothing of value, only a heap of garbage and the unexpected presence of a little girl. The outcast, her hunger evident in her demeanor, made her need known. Han Feng, referred to by her as her older brother, offered silent comfort with the promise that food would be found once Yang's Ware group had departed. Frustration and anger radiated from the rest of the group, who felt that their hard work had amounted to nothing. Maybe the real supplies were the friends we made along the way. Jiang Shiyu's stern gaze fixed on Li Huina, expecting an explanation for the mishap that had left them so empty-handed. Li Huina was forced to stand before the group, their eyes burning with the need for answers as they demanded that she account for the loss. Her expression tightened with distress. Li Huina insisted on the truth. She maintained that she had personally witnessed what lay within Han Feng's room. Confusion and regret shadowed her features as she wondered where everything went awry. A surge of anger overtook her, and Li Huina began to suspect that Han Feng was toying with her. Her frustration mounted, and she silently blamed him for the dire situation in which they now found themselves. With her flashlight beam slicing through the gloom, Li Huine made a sudden move, a rush toward Han Feng in a tense confrontation that spoke of both desperation and betrayal. Han Feng was momentarily blinded by the onslaught of light, his confusion evident as he struggled to process the sudden aggression. In a swift motion, Li Huine disarmed him, grasping the weapon that had long symbolized his authority and held it out as a stark challenge. Now armed herself, Li Huina directed the weapon at Han Feng. Li Ziyi intervened, subtly cautioning her with a look that carried both concern and warning. The unspoken question hung in the air: where were the supplies and why had Han Feng hidden them? The rest of the group gathered at a distance, their eyes fixed on the unfolding standoff. Li Huina's ultimatum was clear: the truth must be revealed or consequences would follow. All attention shifted to Han Feng. The pressure mounted as he was silently compelled to offer an explanation. After a heavy pause, Han Feng's stance betrayed a hint of resignation. His answer was simple. The supplies had been lost to a scam orchestrated by Li Huina long ago. In response, Li Huina tightened her grip on the weapon. Her anger and disbelief intensified as she accused him of lying, her threat of lethal retribution looming over the tense scene. Before the situation could escalate further, someone stepped in, disarming Li Huina with a makeshift object. Her cry of pain punctuated the charged silence. Members of Jiang Shuyu's group quickly surrounded Li Huina, restraining her as she continued to protest her innocence with fervor. Both Han Feng and the outcast fixed their gaze on the discarded weapon, now lying inert on the ground, a silent testament to the violence that had erupted. Jiang Xiu was the first to move toward the fallen gun, his actions deliberate, while Han Feng looked on with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. A standoff ensued between Han Feng and Jiang Xiu. Their expressions were grave, each man holding a quiet determination, their eyes locked in a challenge that spoke of deep-seated distrust. Jin Qinwu's anger spilled over as he seized Li Huina, his grip on her hair a rough manifestation of his fury as he accused her of further deceit. The assault continued as Jin Qinwu yelled, the tension escalating to a breaking point over the truth that remained hidden. In a moment of intervention, Jiang Shuiyu stepped in to halt the violence. His calm, authoritative tone set a boundary, reminding everyone that their location was not meant to become an arena of execution. Jiang Shuiyu sought to restore order, suggesting that Li Huina be given a chance to redeem herself, despite the lingering doubts about her honesty. There was a moment of subdued regret as Jiang Shuiyu offered an apology to Han Feng for the chaotic turn of events, his tone tinged with the weight of responsibility. In a symbolic gesture, Jiang Shuiyu returned the pistol to Han Feng, his actions implying that they too had suffered and that a proper explanation would follow soon. Han Feng accepted the weapon with a measured nod, the atmosphere thick with unspoken promises and uncertain alliances. His face betrayed a mix of surprise and uncertainty as the possibility of joining the committee was laid before him, his expression unreadable. Jiang Shuiyu left the decision open, suggesting that Han Feng take the time to consider the offer. No immediate answer was required. A final instruction was passed along. The group was to report their decision when they returned to collect supplies the next day. As the remnants of Jiang Shuiyu's group departed, the room was left with only Li Ziyi, Han Feng, and the outcast, a fragile trio standing amid the chaos of what had transpired. Li Ziyi glanced over at Han Feng, whose eyes were fixed on the floor. His face remained still, a heavy sigh escaping him as relief washed over him after the confrontation with Jiang Shuiyu's group. Han Feng let out a long yawn, exhaustion and relief mingling now that the ordeal had finally ended. Li Ziyi's eyes widened with quiet admiration as he took in the sight of the outcast's own space, spacious and comfortable, in stark contrast to his own cramped quarters. Han Feng reflected on the success of the earlier operation, giving credit to the outcast for the performance that had played out so well. Before the intrusion by Jiang Shuiyu's group, Han Feng had meticulously given orders: store items in a specific house and leave behind enough trash to suggest the place was still occupied. Han Feng directed Li Zi to open the windows, intent on lowering the temperature inside. Li Zi's brow furrowed in confusion, questioning the purpose of such an action. First thing bro does in a cozy hideout? Open the windows. Peak survival instincts. Han Feng explained the strategy: to create the illusion that their supplies were nearly depleted, thereby inciting frustration and anger among those outside. He continued, contemplating Jiang Shuiju's pervasive influence, and predicting that failure in this plan would only heighten tensions within their own ranks. Han Feng speculated that when chaos inevitably erupted, blame would be cast on the weakest link, namely Li Huina. Wait, let him cook. Li Zi countered the notion, pointing out that even the possession of a gun did not guarantee safety. A stolen weapon had already proven problematic. Han Feng considered that to be the worst-case scenario. He added that Jiang Shui might acquire the gun and use it to project an image of peace and resolution, keeping his reputation intact. Li Zi then entertained another possibility. What if Jiang Shuiyu were to turn that gun against them? Han Feng revealed that he had deliberately allowed his gun to be taken. Its single bullet had already been expended. Li Zizi exposed their hidden objective: to feign suffering while secretly enjoying their newfound freedom. Han Feng, however, admitted that this was not the primary aim. With a steely resolve, he confessed that the true goal was to dismantle Jiang Shuiyu's committee once and for all. In the dim basement car park, a long queue of people waited. A coordinator directed them to form an orderly line, while another, tasked with distributing resources, expressed his gratitude to Jiang Shuiyu. Jiang Shuiyu himself was seen, methodically handing out supplies to the waiting crowd. Nearby, two men carried supplies. One glanced over to confirm that the door had been checked repeatedly, ensuring no breaches. Unbeknownst to these men, Han Feng and Li Ziyi lurked behind them, their presence concealed as they observed every movement. The expressions on the men's faces revealed a mix of uncertainty and concern, caught in a difficult situation that weighed on them. Li Zi outlined the building's layout. The first 4 floors were clear. Families occupied the 5th. Logistics were handled on the 6th. The 7th and 8th floors remained inaccessible. But he suspected the warehouse was located there. Preparing for the next phase, Han Feng and Li Zi readied themselves for infiltration. Li Ziji detailed the plan: distract the guards while Han Feng subdued them with a blunt weapon rather than a gun. Ascending to the 4th floor, the duo was surprised by its emptiness. Han Feng speculated that perhaps the occupants had stepped out for lunch. Reaching the 6th floor yielded a similar result: no one in sight. Li Zi's confusion grew, but Han Feng cautioned him against carelessness. At last they arrived on the 7th floor. Still empty, Han Feng questioned Li Zi's certainty that the warehouse lay on the 7th and 8th floors. Li Zi responded with cautious assurance, though uncertainty lingered. Li Ziyi scanned the floor methodically, noting an unusual absence of guards or any occupants, a silence that spoke volumes. He instructed Han Feng to split up. Li Ziyi would search the left side while Han Feng checked the right. Agreement passed silently between them. A sense of relief washed over Han Feng at the lack of conflict. The mission was focused on scouting, not combat. Back at their unit, Han Feng discussed how the committee's power hinged on their supplies. He laid out a plan to disrupt their stockpile, while Li Ziyi questioned the feasibility of such an endeavor. Han Feng explained that the committee was held together by its resource base. He proposed finding and emptying the warehouse, turning the outcast, now dubbed the Evil King, into the agent tasked with clearing the stocks. The outcast signaled her agreement with a simple thumbs up. In the car park, Han Feng pondered which room might hide the supplies, his thoughts turning to the security measures in place. He turned, sensing movement, a figure approaching from the shadows. He scrutinized a particular room, its door labeled clearly and invitingly accessible. Li Zizi observed that it might indeed be the warehouse. The key was even left in the lock, a detail that did not escape Han Feng's notice. Despite lingering doubts, the decision was made. They would check the warehouse. Before Li Zizi's hand could reach the door handle, Han Feng urged caution, a silent reminder that danger might lurk beyond. Han Feng examined the door closely and discovered a booby trap. Thin wires wound around the key and handle. Li Ziyi concurred, the risk evident in both their expressions. Han Feng warned that more traps, possibly bombs, might lie in wait. With mutual concern, they agreed to proceed slowly, noting the possibility of additional traps in the area. Han Feng recalled overhearing two men discussing checking the door earlier, realizing that their conversation likely pertained to this very trap. Li Ziyi nodded in understanding, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Han Feng instructed Li Ziyi not to tamper with anything. His priority was to locate the warehouse by observing the adjoining floors, and Li Ziyi silently agreed. Armed with flashlights, they moved cautiously. Their beams swept over the darkened corridor as they pinpointed the warehouse's likely location, before strategizing on how to open the trapdoor safely. Han Feng emphasized the need to focus on finding the warehouse first, then devising a method to disarm the trapdoor. Li Zizi listened, his mind already racing through possible solutions. Unexpectedly, the duo from before reappeared from behind the trapdoor, intent on checking its status. Han Feng discussed the plan to extract the supplies while the two groups exchanged puzzled looks. A sudden shout from one of the crew members in the hallway forced Han Feng and Li Ziyi to pause, their sprint coming to an abrupt halt as they caught their breath. Han Feng's caution sharpened as a large figure swung a weapon in their direction, the threat palpable in the air. Reacting instinctively, Li Ziyi raised his baseball bat to block the incoming strike, while Han Feng absorbed a blow on his shoulder from the swinging bat. Li Ziyi responded with force, launching a kick into the assailant's gut. His silent command to Han Feng to run was unmistakable as the confrontation intensified. Elsewhere, two men worked to force open another door. Han Feng questioned the absence of people on that floor, while Li Ziyi admitted that he had not personally scouted it before. Concluding that moving to the next floor might offer a safer route, Han Feng suggested they continue upward, with Li Ziyi in agreement. Finally, Han Feng and Li Ziyi reached the 8th floor, the culmination of their cautious ascent. Li Ziyi's concerned gaze fell on Han Feng's injured arm, a grim reminder that the earlier skirmish might have resulted in a fracture. Han Feng decided that finding a place to hide was paramount, his body and mind urging him to seek shelter before further harm was done. Li Ziyi's attention was drawn to something behind Han Feng, a subtle warning in his tone as he shouted in alarm. Han Feng pivoted, surprise etched on his face as he turned to see what had caught Li Ziyi's attention. Before Han Feng could react further, a hand clamped over his mouth, silencing him instantly. "Dude got yoinked!" Li Ziyi's voice rose in concern as he watched Han Feng being pulled toward a door in the distance, the unfolding events leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Han Feng fell through the room with a dramatic crash, the door slamming shut behind him, sealing off his escape. Lying on the ground, he groaned in pain, his body aching from the sudden fall. A hooded figure loomed over him, watching silently. From the other side of the door, Li Ziyi's voice called out, asking if Han Feng was all right and promising to save him. The hooded figure spoke, his tone calm but firm, revealing his purpose in the building. Han Feng responded, explaining that they had come to collect supplies, an innocent enough reason. The hooded figure reacted with suspicion, his foot stomping onto Han Feng's hand with force, causing him to cry out in pain. The older man, clearly more experienced than he appeared, spoke cryptically. He hinted that he knew more than he let on, mentioning their avoidance of the 5th and 6th floors, suggesting deeper knowledge of the building and its secrets. Han Feng's eyes widened in surprise as he realized where he was. He was in the presence of someone far more dangerous than he expected. The hooded figure challenged Han Feng, questioning his assumption that there were no guards on the floor. Shocked, Han Feng glanced at the wall and spotted a group of people, possibly unconscious, indicating that the hooded figure may have taken them out. Suddenly, voices were heard from outside the room. A group of Jiang Shuyu's goons demanded to know Han Feng's location. Han Feng's thoughts raced. He needed to escape, and his mind snapped back to Li Zi, hoping he was safe. The bearded man clicked his tongue in annoyance, walking toward the window, confusing Han Feng. What was he planning? The hooded figure opened the window, revealing a heavy snowstorm outside. Han Feng's mind began to race, unsure of the man's intentions. He spoke up, questioning what the hooded figure was planning, pointing out that they were on the 8th floor. The hooded figure responded cryptically, stating that the building was technically a 4-story structure. The old man elaborated, explaining that the 3rd and 4th floors were buried under snow, making the jump not as dangerous as it seemed due to the snowbank that had piled up. The old man bluntly told Han Feng that he now had a choice: jump or be beaten to death by the approaching goons. Han Feng's attention was caught by the violent knocking at the door, the pressure mounting as the decision became more urgent. He looked at the window again, anxiety building as he wondered if the fall might still be fatal. With the door bursting open, the goons spotted Han Feng in the snow, shouting to catch him. Han Feng didn't hesitate. He leapt from the window, heading toward the snowbank below. As Han Feng leaped, he activated his purple energy, propelling himself through the air with unnatural force. He landed hard in the snow, the impact jarring his body, but he remained conscious. The white-hailed man looked up, confused, as he watched a purple trail descend into the snow, wondering where it came from. Emerging from the snow, Han Feng looked distressed. His body ached from the hard landing, but he was still alive. The goons looked on in disbelief. Noticing both Han Feng and the white-haired man still alive and seemingly unharmed before their attention shifted upward. Han Feng turned toward the white-hailed man, who was now standing, unsure of what to make of this strange ally. With surprising strength, the white-hailed man used his shoulder to shatter the window, creating an opening to escape the building. Han Feng watched in fear as the old man broke through to the next floor, wondering if he should follow or find another way out. Meanwhile, 3 individuals entered another room. They found it empty, realizing that the people they were chasing must have escaped downward. One of the men instructed another to report the incident to Jiang Suyu. The chase continued, but they were no closer to capturing Han Feng. The scene shifted to a dimly lit room. 3 figures sat around a small fire, trying to stay warm in the cold building. Han Feng observed the bearded man among the group, impressed by his intelligence, realizing the man's tactical awareness. The bearded man urged Han Feng to follow him, directing him toward a staircase leading to the 5th floor. His eyes were calculating and cautious. As they moved, the bearded man warned Han Feng that they might be walking straight into a trap. Han Feng reflected, acknowledging that while the man's plan seemed illogical, it had an eerie sense of correctness to it. The old man spoke again, asking Han Feng if he was afraid of the dead man sitting next to them, hinting at the corpse nearby. Han Feng, still processing everything, asked why the old man was helping him. The old man's response was blunt. He'd rather kill him than leave him alive. The old man elaborated, revealing his admiration for Han Feng's ability to avoid the previous trap. He then proposed a deal: spill what he knew about the committee. The old man threatened Han Feng, warning that if he refused to talk, he'd be forced to become his meat shield, a prospect that made Han Feng sweat with nervousness. Han Feng paused, considering the old man's offer. He pondered whether the committee's interest in him stemmed from his own actions, or if he was simply caught up in their plans by accident. Han Feng asked if the old man had any personal animosity with the committee. The response was straightforward: yes, and Jiang Shuyu hid a secret that he needed to uncover. Han Feng demanded to know what secret Jiang Shuyu was hiding, his voice rising in desperation. The old man chuckled darkly in response, as if amused by Han Feng's insistence. The old man assumed that Han Feng was somehow linked to Jiang Shuyu, suggesting that they might share a deeper connection. The old man gave Han Feng an ultimatum: reveal what he knew about the committee or face the same fate as the corpse beside them. Sweat beaded on Han Feng's brow as he considered his choice, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Han Feng reflected on the night that Jiang Shuyu had barged into his home. He remembered the devastation, explosives tearing through his house, Jiang Shuyu kidnapping his girlfriend, and the supplies being looted. It all felt like a betrayal of the highest order. He quickly grabbed the pistol. The weight of it in his hand reminded him of the only thing he had left to fight back. Han Feng recounted how he had used the pistol in an act of vengeance, but deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. The pistol alone couldn't win this war. He would have to trade everything, even his own life, to settle the score. His strategy was a mix of truth and lies. He planned to present the pistol, to make his story credible, to use fear as his ally. It was all about playing the game. The old man raised an eyebrow. He didn't see the pistol as something special, not to the higher-ups of the committee. In their world, such a weapon was insignificant. Their conversation continued, with the old man pointing out an interesting detail. Jiang Shuyu had allowed Han Feng to keep the pistol. Why? It was an odd decision. Han Feng, now fully aware that his story had piqued the old man's interest, considered the question carefully. Why had Jiang Shuyu allowed him to keep the weapon? The old man's eyes glinted with suspicion. There were two possible reasons, he speculated. Either Jiang Shuyu was sending a message of power, or he had more dangerous weapons hidden away. He leaned forward, asserting that Jiang Shuyu was likely making a show of his dominance. But there was also the possibility that he was storing even deadlier weapons. Either way, Han Feng's situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. The old man's tone shifted. He asked Han Feng if he had brought Li Ziyu to eliminate Jiang Shuyu. Han Feng thought for a moment and considered that, without Jiang Shuyu, the committee might not dare to push things too far. Han Feng reflected that the committee's original intentions had been noble, but Jiang Shuyu's influence had twisted those ideals. People who had lost their conscience were beyond redemption. They couldn't be allowed back into society. Han Feng turned to the old man, his voice steady. He told him to take down the committee. It had become the only solution. The old man paused, mulling over the idea. It wasn't a simple decision, he shot back, challenging Han Feng's plan. The world was cruel. Only the strong survived, and they preyed on the weak. If they followed Han Feng's suggestion, the neighborhood would descend into plunder and chaos. Han Feng then asked the old man if he'd considered what would happen if they ignored it all. The old man, still unconvinced, suggested Han Feng seek a third opinion. Han Feng was puzzled, his gaze moving to the door next to the old man. What did he mean by that? The old man opened the door, and someone began to approach. The tension in the room rose. Before they could speak, a red first aid kit flew through the air, landing near the old man. The old man dodged it effortlessly, raising a fist to strike the person who threw it. But the individual was quick, grabbing the old man's fist midair, stopping the blow. The old man blinked in confusion, unable to understand how his strike had been blocked. In response, the old man swung with his other hand, landing a solid whack. The individual yelped, shouting for him to stop. Han Feng's eyes widened as he saw the new arrival. It was Jin Shui. He called out her name, and the old man, still perplexed, followed his gaze. Jin Shui looked back at them, her surprise evident as she recognized Han Feng. She quickly apologized for eavesdropping. While tending to Han Feng's bandaged arm, she explained that she had hidden in the bedroom after hearing about her grandfather's death. Jin Shui continued, revealing that she had received supplies from Grandpa Li before he passed away. Han Feng seemed to understand her situation, a sudden and tragic loss coupled with an act of survival. The old man let out a short, dry laugh as if dismissing the whole conversation. He pointed an accusing finger at Jin Shui. He believed she had been involved in her grandfather's death, claiming her so-called act of aiding people was nothing more than a selfish joke. Jin Shui didn't deny it. She admitted the old man's accusations were probably true, but she didn't regret her actions. She was simply trying to survive. Her philosophy was pragmatic: save as many people as possible. If you could help, you did. The old man's eyes bored into her, his judgment harsh. Han Feng couldn't help but ask Jin Shui how she had gained access to the old man's place. She confirmed that Jiang Shui had helped her, giving her a pass. Jiang Shui went on to explain that Jiang Shui had provided her with a great deal of supplies. She had no reason to turn him down. He was, after all, a source of stability in an unstable world. The conversation shifted to the disappearance of Grandpa Li. Jin Shui theorized that Jiang Shui had driven him out, seeing him as a liability. Jiang Shui had been systematically removing the elderly and the sick, hoarding resources for the younger generation. It saddened her to learn that she had arrived too late. Grandpa Li had already passed away. The old man shrugged. The committee would be better off with fewer mouths to feed. If he were in Grandpa Li's shoes, he would have done the same thing. Han Feng recalled Li Ziyi's words about a new faction rising up and coming into conflict with the committee. He believed Jiang Shui was targeting them, trying to eliminate any threats to his power. The theory grew, with Han Feng adding that Jiang Shuyi had abandoned the elderly and sick. He was using the youth to hoard supplies, even employing explosives to take control. A fight seemed imminent between Jiang Shuyu's group and this new faction. Han Feng knew that he had to find Jiang Shuyu's weapons. If a battle was coming, he needed to be ready. The old man raised an eyebrow, skeptical of Han Feng's ability to handle the situation alone. Han Feng's voice was firm. He wasn't about to sit and wait for death. He would find the armory and he would find a way out. The old man responded with cynicism, slipping his hoodie over his head. He revealed the harsh truth that the committee was small, weak, and vulnerable in this brutal world. It wouldn't survive much longer. More violence was coming, he warned, before opening the curtain and revealing the snowy wasteland outside. He added that only the strong survive, while the weak are preyed upon. With that, he jumped out the window, disappearing into the night. Han Feng and Jin Shui stood silently, watching the old man leap from the window, the cold wind whipping in his wake. Jin Shui turned to Han Feng, offering her help. Han Feng hesitated. He couldn't put her in danger. He declined her offer. Jin Shui's next words caught Han Feng off guard. Han Feng's next appearance. She had listened to his story, and it had made her furious. Her tone was filled with concern, but also an undeniable intensity. Jin Shui's gaze softened, a hint of fluster in her eyes as she regarded Han Feng with a mix of sympathy and worry. Han Feng sighed, his expression softening as he thanked Jin Shu and asked for her help. In the parking garage basement, Zhang Shuyu's group was having their own discussion. One member confirmed that he had seen Han Feng, having met him just the day before. Suddenly, all eyes turned to the approaching figure. Aha! It was Han Feng. He had arrived, ready for whatever came next. Han Feng collapsed on the floor in a dark hallway, coughing heavily as exhaustion took hold. Jin Qinwen approached, accusing Han Feng of stealing supplies again, his boot making contact with Han Feng's abdomen in a harsh kick. He warned that the next time Han Feng was caught stealing, his arm would be crippled. Before the confrontation could escalate, one of the group members interrupted with a message for Jin Qinwen. Zhang Shuyu had summoned him to meet. Jin Qinwen paused, his mind briefly recalling the request. Han Feng lay there, bound and helpless, as the door shut behind his captors. The green energy surrounding Han Feng began to glow, the rope snapping apart as his power surged. He silently affirmed that his plan to infiltrate the headquarters had been a success. As his wounds began to heal, Han Feng's thoughts drifted to the next phase, finding the armory once he regained enough strength. He just needed to get through this. A pink glowing rope lay discarded on the floor. Han Feng sat, catching his breath after healing himself. He noted how exhausting the process was, and realized he needed a more efficient way to heal specific parts of his body to conserve energy. A faint sound caught Han Feng's attention. He turned towards the door, which had opened slightly. Two group members entered, dragging a restrained man into the room. One asked if they should leave the hostage there, while the other suggested consulting with Zhang Zhu before making a decision. The door opened fully, and Han Feng approached the bound figure, curiosity gnawing at him. His eyes widened in recognition. Li Ziyi's battered face was unmistakable. Li Ziyi, though still recovering from the blows, groggily thanked Han Feng for the effective slap that had jolted him awake. As both men freed themselves from their restraints, they began to speak. Li Ziyi mentioned the slap, explaining it had landed on the side of his face that wasn't swollen, since his other cheek still felt numb. Han Feng acknowledged the reminder and asked about what had happened to Li Ziyi. Li Ziyi began recounting his capture. After being dragged through a door, he had spotted someone about to breach, so he hid in a power distribution room. Within the room, he discovered a large hole that descended much deeper than he had expected. Thinking his pursuers might follow him there, Li Ziyi climbed down the wires into the hole. To his surprise, the hole led to the second basement level instead of the first. The floor was eerily deserted. Li Ziyi turned on his flashlight and found a box filled with tightly sealed containers, all meticulously organized. Curious, he opened a few of the boxes. Inside one, he found sausages, thick as a man's arm, their size strikingly unusual. Just as he was about to inspect one more closely, he heard someone approaching from behind. Li Ziyi recalled waking up next, feeling the sting of a slap from Han Feng. He remembered the many long sausages he had seen earlier. Han Feng, puzzled, asked if they were really sausages. Li Ziyi was unsure, but only noted the shape and immense size. Han Feng couldn't help but wonder, why would they use explosives on his unit and steal supplies if they had so much food? He asked if the packaging indicated they were sausages, but Li Ziyi mentioned there was no writing, just the sausage-like shape and overwhelming size. Something didn't sit right with Han Feng. He suggested the place might be a secret warehouse belonging to Zhang Shuyu. Li Ziyi, unsure, questioned what else they could be. Suddenly, a voice echoed, discussing the urgent need to dispose of Li Ziyi. Both men tensed, realizing the gravity of the situation. Han Feng feared that he might be the next target. When the door opened, the group members were startled to find that Li Ziyi had disappeared. They wondered how he could have escaped while still being tied up. One man suggested checking under the bed. The others peered cautiously around the door, searching for any signs of the missing figure. Li Ziyi, having made his move, jumped onto one of the goods, and two figures collapsed to the floor, bound by ropes. Han Feng spoke quickly. Zhang Shuiyu wanted them dead, and they needed to investigate the boxes. Li Ziyi asked what they would do with the boxes since there were so many scattered about. Li Ziyi reassured Han Feng, claiming they had already made arrangements to meet the evil king first. Han Feng, checking on the evil king, asked if Big Sister had arrived to pick her up. He noted something felt off. The evil king informed Han Feng that the person meant to pick up the Big Sister was the same individual who had stolen his gun and tried to kill him. Han Feng's eyes widened as he realized the person responsible was none other than Li Huina. Han Feng quickly warned the evil king not to open the door. Li Huina, not the expected person, was outside. As he tried to contact her once more, static filled the line. Han Feng turned to Li Ziyi and stated that they needed to go and pick up the evil king. Li Ziyi agreed. Han Feng and Li Ziyi cautiously opened the door, peering down a hallway that appeared empty. Suddenly, crashing noises came from further within the structure, causing concern. Li Ziyi asked about the noise. A chaotic scene unfolded as individuals were directed to different areas based on their vulnerabilities. Jin Qinwen voiced concerns about letting people fight their way up. Doing so would only lead to the loss of supplies and eventual death. He insisted they needed to stop anyone from entering, no matter the situation. As the noise continued, Han Feng speculated it might be a fight involving someone named Li Zhenghao. Li Zuyi stressed the importance of stopping whoever was causing the disturbance. Amid the noise, Li Zuyi suggested that Han Feng wear a mask and blend in with the crowd, hinting at the need for concealment and caution. The two managed to blend into the crowd, watching and waiting as the situation unfolded. A loud groan echoed from the staircase as someone was being stomped on, adding to the confusion and panic. A man appeared, clutching a weapon, glaring at the crowd around him. Han Feng and Li Zi reacted in alarm, ready for whatever came next. Li Huina stood contemplative, her gaze focused on a door. Han Feng stood outside the door, wondering whether he should move into the room. Jin Shui called out to Li Huina, drawing her attention. Jin Shui confronted Li Huina, asking her why she was there. Li Huina fumbled for an excuse, her nervousness apparent. Shifting uneasily, Li Huina claimed she was just searching for food. Jin Shui questioned the need to search for food when so many people were already present, but Li Huina led the way, joined by members of Jiang Xiyu's group. Li Huina glanced at Jin Shui and after a brief pause confirmed the question with a raised brow. She then reciprocated, asking Jin Shui where she was headed. Jin Shui replied that she was heading to treat someone. Nothing more. Suspicion crept across Li Huina's face. She couldn't help but note the connection between Jin Shui and Han Feng, her mind working through the unspoken implications. Soft whispers began between Li Huina and her comrades. There was something off about this situation, something they were starting to piece together. Jingshu was approached by two men, and, with a slight tilt of her head, she reminded Li Huina that Jiangshu had given her the freedom to do her work. Li Huina's eyes narrowed, considering the situation. She believed that Han Feng would never open the door unless it was the nurse. The two men, without hesitation, grabbed hold of the nurse. She shot an apologetic look at Jingshu, but her voice was firm, as she warned them that she wouldn't tolerate such treatment. If they didn't release her, there would be consequences. Jinshu's patience wore thin. She declared she would no longer play nice with them if they continued to hold onto the nurse. Her tone was cold, resolute. In a flash, Jinshu grabbed both men with ease, her strength forcing them to collide mid-air. The sheer force of her movement sent them spiraling before they could react. Li Huina watched from a distance, her eyes wide in shock, as Jinshu effortlessly manhandled her comrades. It was clear the situation had escalated beyond their control. Jinshu, her stance firm, turned to Li Huina and the others. She made it clear, whatever their intentions were, they were not to interfere. Her focus was unyielding. Li Huina's gaze flickered to her pockets, where the glint of a knife caught her eye. It was a last-ditch option, but it was ready. She moved with purpose, the knife in hand, but Jinshu was faster. With a swift step back, she evaded the blade's sharp edge, her movements almost effortless. Li Huina muttered under her breath, acknowledging Jinshu's strength. She called out to her crew, urging them to be cautious. This woman was not someone to take lightly. Suddenly, a door creaked open. Li Huina and the others froze, a strange sensation overtaking them. They looked down at their weapons, feeling an unnatural pull. Something was wrong. The sensation intensified, as though their weapons were being sucked into the air itself. Before they could react, the pull was too much. The weapons were gone. A dark energy swirled in the air, flickering like smoke. Li Huina's eyes widened as she realized who was behind this power. The evil king was making his move. Li Huina was stunned to see her clothes being pulled toward the swirling darkness. The force was unnerving and she struggled to keep her footing. The voices of her comrades rang out in panic as they were sucked into the portal. They yelled out, terrified, claiming they'd found a ghost. The chaos was too much. Meanwhile, in the first basement, a fist connected with a man's face, sending him crashing to the ground. Hooded figures attacked relentlessly, overwhelming their targets. Han Feng and Li Zi ran through the corridors, breathless, as a towering man chased them with an alarming speed. Han Feng, glancing back at the man who was still hot on their trail, questioned why they were being pursued despite Han Feng's earlier punch. Li Zi explained that the punch seemed to have had a heavy impact on the man's cheek, It wasn't enough to stop him. The man, now with a swollen face, bellowed in fury, vowing to take revenge on them for the attack. Han Feng reflected on the surprising effectiveness of the reinforced gloves. He hadn't expected the punch to have such an impact, but in the heat of the moment, it had worked. Both Han Feng and Li Ziyi exchanged looks of frustration. They realized that their escape had only delayed the inevitable. The goons were closing in on them. Han Feng's mind raced. The consequences of getting caught again would be dire. He had to think of something, and fast. He turned to Li Ziyi, urging him to go and pick up the evil king while he handled their pursuers. He was confident that he could distract them long enough. Li Ziyi hesitated, clearly worried about the impromptu plan, but Han Feng reassured him. He knew exactly what he was doing. Han Feng jumped onto a passing car, his feet finding purchase as someone in the crowd shouted for him to stop. Standing tall on the car, Han Feng raised his hand to get the crowd's attention. His voice boomed as he demanded they listen to him. It was time for his declaration. With a sly grin, Han Feng revealed that he was one of the people responsible for inflating the prices of supplies. He didn't care how it sounded. With a flip of his finger, he made sure they heard him loud and clear, taunting them with hopes of their starvation. The crowd seethed, enraged by his arrogance. They began to shout, demanding his life. Han Feng smirked, ready for the chaos to unfold. As Han Feng bolted toward a metal gate, he couldn't help but wonder if it would be locked. It was his only hope to escape the enraged crowd. Before he could reach it, a fist collided with his chest. Pain exploded through his body, and he cried out in agony. The force of the punch sent Han Feng flying into the air. As he came back down, his body slammed into the metal gate, leaving him gasping for breath. Han Feng gripped the gate as his body trembled. The crowd, enraged, closed in around him, shouting that he would pay for his insolence. Summoning a strange power, Han Feng's hand glowed with a pink orb. With a surge of energy, the orb absorbed the metal gate, pulling it into the air and leaving the crowd in stunned silence. The glow around the gate faded, and the crowd, still confused, could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. They were no closer to understanding what was happening. Han Feng, standing defiantly in front of them, challenged the crowd. He taunted them to come after him, ready for whatever came next. The metal gate, still in the air, began to crack. Han Feng could feel the tension rising. Danger was imminent. Without warning, an avalanche of snow and debris cascaded down on the crowd. Panic spread like wildfire as people scrambled to escape. The towering man, caught in the avalanche, cursed under his breath, unable to free himself from the falling debris. As others struggled to escape, the panic set in. People shouted to get inside, desperate to escape the destruction. The avalanche wreaked havoc on the parking structure, leaving nothing but chaos in its wake. A hand emerged from the thick snow and ice. Han Feng coughed as he struggled to get air. He had survived, but for how long? Han Feng slowly pulled himself to his feet, his body aching from the impact. He wondered aloud if he was growing stronger. Just then, a voice broke through his thoughts, asking if he was waiting for death. Han Feng turned to face the voice. To his surprise, it was the old man from earlier. The recognition hit him like a ton of bricks. A sense of suspicion washed over Han Feng. He wondered just how long the old man had been watching him. Something didn't feel right. Someone shouted that the avalanche had finally stopped. The calm after the storm, but was it really over? The old man reached down, pulling Han Feng up with surprising strength. Han Feng couldn't shake the feeling that something important was unfolding. In a quiet corner of the basement, Han Feng asked the old man about his identity and motives. It was time for answers. The man, with a dry chuckle, introduced himself as Li Zhenghao. Han Feng's eyes widened in surprise. Li Zhenghao's name sent a jolt of realization through Han Feng. This was the same man who had fought against Zhang Shouyu. The dark-haired man eyed Li Zhenghao with suspicion. This was no coincidence. Li Zhenghao, unfazed, extended his hand for a handshake, confirming his identity and intentions. He seemed calm, confident. Han Feng, still unsure, asked what this handshake meant. Li Zhenghao, with a smile, explained that he had changed his mind about working together. Han Feng couldn't help but wonder if Li Zhenghao was trying to scam him. The old man's sudden shift in attitude didn't sit well with him. Li Zhenghao didn't waste time. He pressed Han Feng for a straight answer, yes or no. The decision had to be made. Han Feng thought carefully, weighing the potential benefits of teaming up. With Zhang Shouyu still a threat, maybe this was the best chance for success. Finally, Han Feng agreed to cooperate. He made it clear that while he didn't trust Li Zhenghao, they shared a common goal, and that was enough. A handshake was sealed. Han Feng, though still wary, expressed his readiness to work with Li Zhenghao.